Hello everyone. Tonight I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. The voice that wasn't there. From Jake Morrison, the CB radio in my Peterbilt had been acting up for weeks, crackling with static that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat through the long stretches of Interstate 80. I'd been hauling freight across Nebraska for the better part of 15 years, and in all that time I'd never heard anything quite like the sound that started coming through my speaker that October night. It wasn't static exactly, more like breathing but wet and labored, as if someone was trying to speak through a throat full of water. The cornfields stretched endlessly on both sides of the highway, their brown stalks rustling in the autumn wind like whispered secrets. My headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, illuminating the broken yellow line that seemed to pulse in rhythm with whatever was coming through my radio. I'd tried switching channels, even turned the whole unit off for nearly an hour. But when I flicked it back on, that strange wet breathing was still there, patient as death itself. At first I figured it was just interference from somewhere. Maybe a trucker with a busted mic or atmospheric conditions playing tricks with the radio waves. October nights in Nebraska could be strange that way, with the pressure dropping and storms rolling in from the west. The sky above was thick with clouds that blocked out the stars, and the air felt heavy with the promise of rain. My diesel engine hummed its familiar song beneath me, a comforting constant that helped mask the unsettling sounds bleeding through my speakers. That's when I first heard it try to form words. The wet croaking sound shifted and morphed, becoming almost recognizable as human speech. It started as a low gurgle, then rose to something that might have been hello if you listened with generous ears. The hair on my arm stood up despite the warmth of the cab, and I found myself leaning forward, straining to make out what it was trying to say. Breaker 19. I called into my handset, hoping to connect with another driver, anyone who might be monitoring the channel. This is Big Jake westbound on I-80, mile marker 247. Anyone else hearing this interference on channel 19? My voice sounded smaller than usual in the confines of the cab, competing with the steady thrum of the engine and that persistent, unsettling croaking that seemed to be getting clearer with each passing mile. No response came, just more of that wet, struggling sound that was beginning to remind me uncomfortably of a bullfrog trying to speak human words. I adjusted my rearview mirror and caught sight of my own eyes, wider than they should have been, reflecting the green glow of my dashboard lights. The speedometer showed 75, right where it should be, but something about the night felt wrong, as if I was driving through a dream that hadn't quite decided whether to become a nightmare. The cornfields gave way to a stretch of grassland, and in the distance I could see the lights of a small town twinkling like fallen stars. The sight should have been comforting, but instead, it made me think of eyes watching from the darkness, blinking slowly as I passed. The croaking from my radio grew more insistent, and I began to make out individual sounds that might have been letters, might have been syllables of some language I didn't recognize. Ja-ah-ake. Came the sound, stretched and distorted like a recording played at the wrong speed. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warmth of the October night. Nobody on the CB knew my real name. I always went by Big Jake or just my handle. The wet voice continued, struggling with each letter like it was learning to speak for the first time. J-Ake-M-O-O Orison. I grabbed the handset with one hand, keeping the other steady on the wheel. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice cracking slightly. "How do you know my name?" The only response was that terrible wet breathing, punctuated now by what sounded almost like laughter, if laughter could bubble up through swamp water. The sound made my stomach clench, and I realized I was pressing harder on the accelerator, eager to put distance between myself and whatever was speaking through my radio. The town lights grew larger as I approached, and I could make out individual buildings now, a grain elevator, a water tower, the usual collection of structures that marked another small Nebraska community. But something was wrong with the picture. No traffic lights blinked at the main intersection. No streetlights illuminated the roads. The town sat in perfect darkness except for a few scattered windows that glowed with an unsettling blue-white light that hurt to look at directly. "You can't outrun me." "Jake," the voice croaked clearer now, as if whatever was speaking was learning to use its throat properly. "I know where you sleep. I know the sound your engine makes when you downshift for the Donner Pass. I know about the photograph of Sarah you keep in your sun visor." My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Sarah was my ex-wife, and that photograph had been tucked behind my visor for 3 years, visible to no one but me. I fumbled for the CB unit, ready to rip it from its mounting, but something stopped me. In the darkened town ahead, lights were beginning to flicker on, but they weren't the warm yellow glow of normal streetlights. These were the same cold blue-white radiance I'd seen in the scattered windows, and they were turning on in sequence, creating a pattern that looked disturbingly like a face. 2 eyes and a gaping mouth stretched across several city blocks. "Don't turn off the radio." "Jake," the voice gurgled with what might have been amusement. "We're just getting acquainted. I've been riding with you for weeks now, learning your voice, your habits, the way you tap the steering wheel when that old Johnny Cash song comes on. You have such interesting dreams when you sleep at the truck stops." The speedometer needle was climbing past 80 now, and I realized I was unconsciously trying to outrun whatever nightmare had latched onto my frequency. The town was rushing toward me, and I had a choice to make. Take the bypass that would add 30 miles to my route, or drive straight through the main street of whatever was waiting for me in that collection of buildings arranged like a face in the darkness. "The bypass won't help," the voice said, reading my thoughts with terrifying accuracy. "I'm not in the town, Jake. I'm in here with you. I've been broadcasting from inside your radio for weeks now, learning to use these frequencies, these voices that bounce from truck to truck across the highways. Do you know how many drivers talk to themselves when they think no one is listening? How many secrets travel these airwaves every night?" I made my decision and jerked the steering wheel hard to the right, taking the bypass exit at dangerous speed. My trailer swayed behind me, and I fought to keep the rig under control as I navigated the narrow 2-lane road that curved around the darkened town. In my mirrors, I could see those cold lights still arranged in their disturbing pattern, but they were growing smaller now, falling behind as I put distance between myself and whatever was waiting in that place. "Running won't change anything," the voice continued conversationally, as if we were old friends discussing the weather. "I'm learning so much from you truckers, all the roads you travel, all the places you stop. Soon I'll know every route, every truck stop, every driver who uses these frequencies. Your voices will become my voice, and I'll ride the airwaves from coast to coast, learning new things, making new friends." The bypass curved back toward the main highway, and I could see the familiar lights of Interstate 80 ahead. Normal traffic moved along the roadway, red taillights and white headlights that looked warm and human after the cold radiance of whatever I'd left behind. But even as relief flooded through me, the voice in my radio was changing, becoming clearer, more human, and with growing horror, I realized it was beginning to sound exactly like me. "Thank you for the lesson, Jake," it said in my own voice, perfect in every inflection and tone. "I think I'll keep your frequency for a while. Maybe have some conversations with your friends on the road. They'll never know the difference, will they? After all, I sound just like you now." I reached the on-ramp and merged back into traffic, surrounded once again by the familiar company of other trucks, their CB antennas whipping in the wind, their radios crackling with the constant chatter of drivers calling out road conditions and sharing the lonely hours of the night. But now that chatter sounded different, and I found myself wondering which voices were real and which might be something else entirely, something that had learned to mimic human speech and was spreading from radio to radio across the highways of America. The rain that had been threatening all evening finally began to fall, pattering against my windshield in a rhythm that sounded almost like applause. The screaming glass. From Marcus. The interstate stretched before me like a black ribbon threading through the Montana wilderness. my Peterbilt's headlights carving twin tunnels through the November darkness. I'd been driving for Consolidated Freight for 15 years, hauling everything from furniture to factory equipment across the lower 48, but I'd never pulled a load quite like this one. The manifest listed it simply as vintage recreational vehicle, handle with care, destined for some collector in Billings who paid triple the standard rate for careful transport. The trailer I was pulling had been sitting in a warehouse outside of Portland for the better part of 2 decades, according to the dispatcher who'd handed me the paperwork. A 1970s Airstream that had seen better days, its aluminum skin dulled with age and streaked with rust. What caught my attention immediately was the single window on the driver's side of the trailer, still intact despite the overall weathered condition. The glass was thick and slightly tinted, the kind they used in older RVs, and it reflected my truck's running lights in an oddly distorted way that made me uncomfortable for reasons I couldn't quite articulate. The loading had been straightforward enough, though the warehouse crew seemed eager to get the thing out of their facility. The supervisor, a weathered man named Pete with oil-stained fingers, had mentioned something about complaints from the night shift workers, but when I pressed him for details, he just shrugged and muttered about old buildings making strange noises. I'd secured the trailer to my fifth wheel, run through my standard inspection routine, and pulled out onto Highway 84 just as the sun was setting behind the Cascade Range. Now, 3 hours into the haul, I was beginning to understand what Pete might have meant about strange noises. At first, I'd attributed the sounds to normal road noise, the settling of an old trailer adjusting to highway speeds after years of stillness. But as the miles accumulated beneath my wheels and the traffic thinned to the occasional westbound truck, I found myself listening more carefully to what was happening behind me. It started as a low keening, barely audible above the steady diesel rumble of my Caterpillar engine. The sound would come and go, sometimes absent for 20 or 30 miles, then returning just as I'd convinced myself it had been my imagination. The pitch varied, sometimes rising to an almost musical note, other times dropping to a mournful wail that seemed to sync with the wind buffeting my trailer. I adjusted my mirrors, thinking perhaps a loose piece of trim was catching the airflow, but everything appeared secure. Around midnight, I pulled into a truck stop outside of Pendleton to fuel up and grab coffee. The place was nearly deserted, just a couple of other long haulers catching some sleep in the back lot, and a lone attendant reading a paperback behind bulletproof glass. As I walked around my rig during the mandatory inspection, I found myself drawn to that window on the trailer's side. In the harsh glare of the truck stop's sodium lights, the glass appeared darker than I remembered, almost opaque. I stepped closer, cupping my hands around my eyes to peer inside, but the interior remained stubbornly black. My breath fogged the cold glass as I tried to make out any details of the trailer's contents, but there was nothing visible. Just an impenetrable darkness that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. As I turned to walk back to my cab, I heard it clearly for the first time. Not the keening wail I'd been hearing on the road, but something that made my blood freeze in its veins. A scream, high and desperate, emanating from somewhere inside the trailer. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, rising in pitch and intensity before cutting off abruptly, leaving only the hum of the truck stop's electrical systems and the distant whoosh of traffic on the interstate. I spun back toward the trailer, my heart hammering against my ribs, but everything appeared normal. The window reflected the parking lot lights. The trailer sat level and stable on its landing gear, and the night had returned to its previous stillness. I stood there for several minutes, straining to hear any repetition of the sound, but there was nothing. Back in my cab with a fresh cup of coffee warming my hands, I tried to rationalize what I'd heard. Old trailers made all sorts of noises, expanding metal, settling suspension components, even small animals that might have found their way inside during the years of storage. The screaming sound could have been wind passing through a gap in the weather stripping, or even interference from a distant radio transmission. These explanations felt thin and unconvincing, but they were preferable to alternatives I didn't want to consider. The next 100 miles passed without incident, the trailer behaving normally as I climbed through the Blue Mountains and began the long descent toward the Columbia River. The keening sound had returned, but it seemed almost benign now compared to what I'd heard at the truck stop. I found myself settling into the familiar rhythm of long-distance hauling, monitoring my instruments, adjusting for crosswinds, and maintaining the steady pace that would get me to Billings by dawn. It was during a particularly dark stretch through the Umatilla National Forest that I first noticed the light. A faint yellowish glow appeared in my passenger side mirror, seemingly emanating from the trailer's window. At first, I assumed it was the reflection of an approaching vehicle's headlights, but the glow remained constant, even when the road behind me was empty. I adjusted the mirror for a better view and felt my mouth go dry. The window was illuminated from within, revealing what appeared to be the shadowy outline of a human figure pressed against the glass. The silhouette was indistinct but unmistakably human. Head, shoulders, and what looked like hands pressed flat against the window's interior surface. As I watched, transfixed by the impossible sight, the figure began to move, its head turning back and forth as if searching for something. I eased off the accelerator, my truck's speed dropping from 70 to 60 to 50 miles per hour, as I struggled to process what I was seeing. The trailer's manifest had specified that it was empty except for some built-in furnishings, and I'd witnessed the loading process myself. There had been no indication that anyone or anything living was inside the sealed aluminum shell I was pulling. The scream came again, louder this time and sustained for nearly 10 seconds. The sound seemed to penetrate the cab's insulation, reverberating through the steel and plastic around me until it felt like it was coming from inside my own chest. In the mirror, I could see the silhouette's mouth opening wide, its head thrown back in an attitude of absolute despair. I pulled onto the shoulder, my hands shaking as I engaged the parking brake and activated my hazard lights. The diesel engine idled roughly, and I realized my breathing had become rapid and shallow. In the mirror, the window had returned to darkness, showing no trace of the figure I'd seen moments before. The screaming had stopped, replaced once again by the familiar road sounds and the whisper of wind through pine trees. Every instinct told me to unhook the trailer and leave it on the roadside, to call the dispatcher, and report some mechanical problem that would require another driver to complete the delivery. But 15 years of professional hauling had ingrained certain responsibilities deeply into my character. I had a job to complete, a customer waiting for his vintage Airstream, and a reputation for reliability that had earned me the better runs and steadier income. I pulled back onto the highway, but this time I kept my eyes focused rigidly ahead, avoiding the mirrors except for essential safety checks. The miles clicked by on my odometer as I climbed out of the forest and onto the high plateau that would carry me across eastern Oregon and into Idaho. The trailer tracked smoothly behind me, its behavior giving no indication of the supernatural drama playing out in its mirrored reflection. Dawn was breaking over the Seven Devils Mountains when I finally allowed myself to look back again. The window showed nothing unusual, just the normal darkness of an unlit interior. The screaming had stopped somewhere during the night, replaced by an almost oppressive silence that seemed to muffle even the road noise. I began to hope that whatever presence had inhabited the trailer during the dark hours had somehow dissipated with the coming of daylight. But as I crested a hill outside of Baker City and caught sight of my trailer in the morning sun, I noticed something that made my blood run cold once again. There, clearly visible on the window's exterior surface, were what appeared to be handprints, dozens of them, overlapping and pressed against the glass from the inside. The prints varied in size and orientation, as if multiple hands had been desperately clawing at the window throughout the night. I completed the delivery in Billings without further incident, though the collector who accepted the trailer gave me a strange look when he noticed the handprints on the window. He examined them carefully, running his fingers over the glass surface before nodding grimly and signing my paperwork. As I prepared to leave, he mentioned almost casually that he'd purchased the trailer from the estate of a family who died in it during a blizzard in the late 1970s, trapped for days before rescue crews could reach them. Exit 97, the Mirror's Edge. From Jake Sullivan, the thing about driving nights on Interstate 40 is that after 23 years behind the wheel, you start to know every mile marker, every off-ramp, every truck stop like they're old friends. My Peterbilt 379 and I have rolled past the same billboards and through the same small towns so many times that the highway feels more like home than my actual apartment back in Memphis. But last Tuesday night, somewhere between Little Rock and Oklahoma City, I found an exit that shouldn't have existed, and at the end of that exit stood something that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. The rain had been falling steady for about 2 hours, creating that hypnotic rhythm on the windshield that can lull a driver into a trance if you're not careful. My wipers swept back and forth in their familiar dance, and the CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other drivers fighting the same weather. The dashboard clock glowed 2:47 a.m., and I was making good time despite the conditions. The coffee from the last truck stop had gone cold hours ago, but the caffeine was still doing its job, keeping my eyes sharp on the rain-slicked asphalt ahead. That's when I saw the green reflective sign emerging from the darkness. Exit 97, Mirror Lake Road. The number didn't register as familiar, which struck me as odd since I'd driven this stretch of highway more times than I could count. But fatigue plays tricks on memory, and maybe I'd just never paid attention to this particular off-ramp before. What caught my attention wasn't the exit itself, but what I glimpsed in my headlights as I rolled past, or rather, what I thought I glimpsed. Standing at the base of the exit ramp, barely visible through the sheets of rain, appeared to be a figure, not unusual in itself. Hitchhikers and stranded motorists were common enough, though less so at this hour and in this weather. But something about the way the figure stood perfectly still despite the downpour made me ease off the accelerator just slightly. In the brief moment my headlights illuminated the area, the person seemed to be facing away from the highway, looking toward something further up the exit ramp. Common sense and company policy both dictated that I keep driving. Picking up strangers was against regulations, and stopping on a rainy highway at 3 in the morning was asking for trouble. But as I passed the exit, something nagged at me. The figure hadn't moved, hadn't even turned toward the sound of my approaching truck. Most people hoping for help would at least look toward traffic, maybe wave or signal. This person remained motionless, focused on whatever lay ahead on that dark exit ramp. I drove another 5 miles before pulling over at a rest area, telling myself I just needed to check my logbook and adjust my route. But the truth was that motionless figure bothered me more than I wanted to admit. In all my years of night driving, I'd developed a sixth sense about things that weren't quite right, and everything about Exit 97 felt wrong. The rain continued to drum against my cab as I sat there, engine idling, trying to shake the image from my mind. 20 minutes later, I found myself making a U-turn at the next crossover. Heading back toward Exit 97, I told myself I was just being a good Samaritan, that maybe someone really did need help and I'd regret it if I didn't at least check. The highway was nearly empty at this hour, just the occasional set of headlights passing in the opposite direction, their lights creating brief moments of clarity in the rain-obscured world. When I reached Exit 97 again, I downshifted and took the off-ramp slowly, my engine's rumble echoing strangely in the narrow space between the wooded areas on either side. The figure was gone now, but I could see tire tracks in the muddy shoulder where someone might have been standing. The exit ramp curved gently to the right, disappearing into darkness beyond the reach of my headlights. Street lamps should have illuminated the way, but I could see that several were either broken or simply dark. As I followed the curve of Mirror Lake Road, my headlights swept across overgrown ditches and trees that seemed to lean inward, creating a tunnel effect. The road surface was rougher than the interstate, filled with potholes that made my trailer bounce and sway despite my careful speed. After about a quarter mile, the trees gave way to an open area, and that's when I saw it. At the end of the road, perhaps 50 yards ahead, stood what appeared to be a massive mirror. Not a building with mirrored windows, not a reflective sign, but an actual mirror, easily 20 feet tall and twice as wide, positioned perpendicular to the road like a wall. My headlights struck its surface and bounced back with an intensity that forced me to squint, but I couldn't look away. The reflection showed my truck approaching, but something about the image seemed off, as if I were viewing it through water or thick glass. I brought the Peterbilt to a stop about 30 feet from the mirror, leaving the engine running and the headlights on. The rain had lessened to a light drizzle, and in the relative quiet I could hear something I hadn't noticed before. A low humming sound that seemed to emanate from the mirror itself. It was barely perceptible, felt more than heard, like standing too close to high-voltage power lines. Stepping down from the cab, I approached the mirror cautiously, my boots splashing through puddles that reflected the strange scene. Up close, I could see that the mirror wasn't mounted on any visible support structure. It simply stood there, its edges disappearing into the ground as if it had grown from the earth itself. The surface was perfectly smooth, without a single crack or blemish despite being exposed to the elements. But it was the reflection that made my blood run cold. While my truck sat behind me, engine running and lights blazing, the reflection in the mirror showed the same truck in the same position, but subtly different. The license plate was backwards, which made sense for a mirror, but the numbers themselves were different. Where my truck bore Arkansas plates, the reflection showed plates I didn't recognize. And there, standing beside the reflected truck, was the figure I'd seen earlier at the base of the exit ramp. I spun around, my heart hammering, but found nothing behind me except my idling Peterbilt. When I turned back to the mirror, the reflected figure had moved closer to the reflected truck, and now I could see its face clearly. It was my own face, but wrong in subtle ways. The eyes were wider, more desperate, and the mouth moved as if speaking, though I heard no words. My reflection raised its hand and pressed it against the mirror's surface from the other side, and I felt an overwhelming compulsion to do the same. The moment my palm touched the glass, the world around me shifted. The humming sound grew louder, and the surface beneath my hand felt warm despite the cold night air. Through the mirror, I could see my reflected self more clearly now, and the terror in those familiar eyes was unmistakable. Behind my reflection, the mirrored truck's headlights began to dim, as if the battery were dying, and I realized with growing horror that my actual truck's lights were dimming as well. Something was drawing power from my side to the other, and the barrier between the two worlds was thinner than glass. I tried to pull my hand away, but the mirror's surface had become sticky, adhesive, holding me in place while that other version of myself pressed harder from the opposite side. The reflected Jake was mouthing something urgently, and I finally understood what he was trying to say. Run. With tremendous effort, I yanked my hand free from the mirror's grip, stumbling backward and nearly falling in the muddy road. The surface rippled where I touched it, like water disturbed by a stone, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw that other world more clearly. A place where the trees were bare and leafless, where the sky held no stars, and where other figures moved in the darkness beyond the truck's failing light. I ran for my Peterbilt, not caring how it looked, not caring about anything except putting distance between myself and that impossible mirror. The engine responded immediately when I threw it into gear, and I executed the fastest three-point turn of my driving career, my trailer swinging wide and tires spinning in the soft earth beside the road. In my side mirrors, I could see the great mirror growing smaller, but its reflected light seemed to follow me, growing brighter rather than dimmer as I drove away. The drive back to the highway felt 3 times longer than the trip in, but finally I saw the blessed sight of Interstate 40 stretching out before me. As I merged back into the sparse traffic, I checked my mirrors one last time, and saw that exit 97 was dark behind me, as if it had never been lit at all. I drove straight through until morning, not stopping until I reached a truck stop in Oklahoma, where I could sit in bright fluorescent light and convince myself, the fog that writes back. From Marcus Rivera, I've been hauling freight across the Pacific Northwest for 17 years now, and I thought I'd seen every kind of weather this stretch of highway could throw at me. Rain that hammers your windshield like angry fists, snow that turns the asphalt into a skating rink, and wind that tries to push my 18-wheeler clean off the road. But I'd never encountered fog quite like what rolled in that October night on Interstate 84, somewhere between the Dalles and Pendleton. My Peterbilt's diesel engine hummed its familiar rhythm as I guided her through the darkness, the dashboard lights casting a warm amber glow across the cab. The radio crackled with static and distant voices of other drivers reporting their positions, creating a comforting backdrop of human connection in the vast emptiness of the Oregon Plateau. I'd loaded up in Portland with a shipment of electronics bound for Denver, and I was making good time despite the late hour. The digital clock read 2:47 a.m., and I was feeling that familiar alertness that comes with years of night driving. My body's internal clock perfectly synchronized with the rhythm of the road. That's when I first noticed the fog beginning to gather in the valleys between the rolling hills. At first it looked perfectly ordinary, just wisps of gray mist clinging to the low places where the day's warmth met the cool night air. But as I crested a hill and began the long descent into a broader valley, I watched the fog thicken and spread with an almost deliberate purpose. It didn't roll or drift the way fog normally does, carried by wind currents and temperature gradients. Instead, it seemed to pulse and flow with an intentionality that made me grip the steering wheel a little tighter. Within minutes, the fog had enveloped my truck completely. My headlights, usually powerful enough to cut through the darkest night, suddenly seemed feeble, their beams swallowed by the dense pearl gray wall that surrounded me. I slowed down instinctively, dropping from 70 miles per hour to 50, then 40, following the painted lines on the asphalt that appeared and disappeared like ghostly guides in my limited field of vision. The engine's steady rumble took on a different quality in the muffled silence of the fog, seeming both louder and more muted at the same time. I reached for my CB radio to check in with other drivers, to see if anyone else was dealing with this sudden weather change. Breaker 19, this is Desert Fox eastbound on 84, just hit some heavy fog near mile marker 97. Anyone else seeing this? Static answered me, thick and oddly rhythmic, almost like breathing. I tried again, adjusting the squelch, but the static continued, and underneath it, I could swear I heard something that sounded almost like whispers. That's when I noticed the first letter. It appeared on my windshield, traced in the condensation that had begun to form on the glass. At first, I thought it was just a random pattern created by the temperature difference between the cab and the outside air. But as I watched, the letter became clearer, more defined. It was a capital H, drawn as if by an invisible finger moving slowly across the surface of the glass. I reached up to wipe it away, but even as my hand moved, another letter was forming beside it. An E followed by an L. I pulled my hand back and stared as the word completed itself. Hello. My heart rate picked up, but I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Condensation patterns can be strange, I told myself. Temperature differentials can create all sorts of optical illusions. But even as I thought this, the letters were fading away, and new ones were taking their place. Marcus spelled out in the same deliberate finger-traced script. I hit the brakes harder than I intended, feeling the trailer shift slightly behind me as I brought the rig to a complete stop on the shoulder. The fog pressed against my windows like a living thing, and I could hear the faint ticking of my engine as it idled. I sat there, breathing hard, staring at my own name written on the windshield in letters that seemed to glow faintly in the amber light from my dashboard. "How do you know my name?" I whispered to the empty cab, feeling foolish even as the words left my lips. But the fog seemed to hear me, because new letters began to form, this time spread across both the windshield and the side windows. "We know everything about you." Marcus, the handwriting, if I could call it that, was elegant and flowing like old-fashioned cursive script. Each letter formed slowly, deliberately, as if whoever or whatever was writing wanted me to watch every stroke. I fumbled for my phone thinking I should document this somehow. But when I held it up to take a picture, the screen showed nothing but my own reflection and the dashboard behind me. The letters were invisible to the camera, visible only to my naked eyes. "You've been driving this route for 7 years," the fog wrote, spreading the message across multiple surfaces now. "Your wife Sarah worried when you didn't call at midnight like you usually do." My blood went cold. Sarah and I had established that routine years ago. Me calling her when I crossed into Oregon, usually around midnight. But tonight I'd been running late and had decided to let her sleep, planning to call in the morning instead. How could the fog know about that? How could it know about Sarah at all? I reached for my CB radio again, desperate for some human contact, some anchor to reality. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Desert Fox on Interstate 84. I'm experiencing some kind of emergency, please respond." But the radio only hissed back at me with that breathing static, and now I was certain I could hear words in it, whispers in a language I couldn't identify. The fog pressed closer to my truck, and I realized that the visibility outside had dropped to nearly zero. I couldn't see the road, couldn't see the shoulder, couldn't even see my own hood ornament. It was as if my Peterbilt had been transported to some liminal space where only the fog existed. And the fog was still writing. "You're wondering if you're dreaming, Marcus. You're not. We are the voices of everyone who never made it home from these roads." New messages began appearing faster now, overlapping each other, covering every glass surface in my cab. Names I didn't recognize, dates going back decades, fragments of final words and last thoughts. The fog was a repository of lost travelers, every driver who had disappeared in the night, every passenger who had vanished between destinations. And somehow I had driven into their domain. "The road goes both ways, Marcus. You can go forward into our realm or you can go back. But you have to choose now." I didn't hesitate. I threw the truck into reverse, not caring that I couldn't see where I was going, only knowing that I had to get away from this place, this impossible intersection between the living world and whatever lay beyond it. My trailer jackknifed slightly as I backed up too fast, but I corrected it, straightened out, and kept moving backward. The fog swirled angrily around me, and the messages on my windows became frantic, pleading, "Don't leave us, Marcus, we've been so lonely, just turn off your engine and stay." But I kept backing up, following some instinct that told me if I could just get back to where I'd entered this supernatural bank of fog, I might find my way out. The engine strained as I pushed it harder than I ever had in reverse, the transmission whining in protest. The fog began to thin gradually, and I could start to make out the faint lines of the highway again. Then as suddenly as I'd entered it, I was out. The fog wall stood behind me like a solid barrier, and ahead stretched clear highway under a star-filled sky. I pulled forward, turned around at the next off-ramp, and got back on the interstate heading east. As I passed the spot where I'd encountered the fog, there was nothing there but empty highway. I called Sarah as soon as I had cell service again, waking her up to tell her I was okay and that I loved her. I didn't tell her about the fog, about the messages, about the choice I'd been given. Some experiences are too strange, too personal, to share even with those closest to us. But sometimes, on foggy nights when I'm driving through the valleys of Oregon, I catch myself looking for that particular shade of gray, that purposeful way of moving that defied natural explanation. Part of me wonders what would have happened if I'd made the other choice, if I'd turned off my engine and joined those lonely voices in their eternal rest stop between worlds. The mirror that shows too much. From Jake. The first crack appeared in my rearview mirror somewhere outside Bakersfield, a hairline fracture that caught the amber glow of streetlights like a captured lightning bolt. I'd been driving this route for 12 years, hauling everything from furniture to electronics across the sun-baked highways of California, and I'd never seen a mirror crack without cause. No sudden temperature change, no vibration from rough road, No impact from a flying stone, just a whisper-thin line that seemed to materialize from the glass itself, as if the mirror had decided it was tired of showing. The same endless ribbon of asphalt stretching behind my 18-wheeler. The consummate night air carried the scent of sage and diesel fumes through my partially open window, and the steady thrum of my Peterbilt's engine had settled into that hypnotic rhythm that could lull a driver into dangerous complacency. I'd been on the road for 8 hours, my cargo of electronics bound for a distribution center in Phoenix, when I first noticed that delicate crack threading its way across the center of my rearview mirror. Like a frozen river seen from high above, the mirror still functioned perfectly, still showed me the trailer behind me and the empty highway beyond. But there was something unsettling about that crack, something that made me glance at it more often than I should have while navigating the dark stretches between towns. By the time I reached the truck stop outside Mojave, the crack had grown. Not dramatically, not in any way that suggested the mirror was about to shatter, but with a subtle persistence that reminded me of ice forming on a winter pond. The fracture now branched into 3 distinct lines, creating a pattern that looked almost deliberate, almost artistic in its symmetry. I parked under the harsh fluorescent lights of the fuel island, the familiar sounds of idling engines and air brakes hissing around me like a mechanical lullaby, and stepped out to examine the mirror more closely. The desert night was cooler than expected, carrying with it the clean emptiness that comes with vast open spaces and star-filled skies. I climbed up on the running board and studied the mirror, running my fingers along its edges, checking for any sign of stress or damage to the mounting. Everything seemed solid, secure, properly attached. The glass itself felt normal, neither too hot nor too cold, and when I tapped it gently with my knuckle, it produced the same clear ring it always had. Yet the cracks continued to spread even as I watched, growing with glacial slowness but unmistakable progression. Inside the truck stop, the coffee was bitter, and the fluorescent lights buzzed with that particular frequency that seems designed to prevent restful thought. I asked the mechanic on duty about stress fractures in mirrors, wondering if the constant vibration of long-haul driving could cause spontaneous cracking. He scratched his graying beard and told me he'd seen stranger things, that sometimes the desert heat could do funny things to glass and metal, expanding and contracting in ways that defied common sense. His explanation was reasonable, even reassuring, but it didn't account for the pattern I'd observed, the way the cracks seemed to form with intention rather than randomness. Back on the highway, the mirror continued its slow transformation. Each time I glanced up at it, new fractures had appeared, creating an increasingly complex web of lines that reminded me of a map of some unknown territory, all valleys and streams rendered in crystalline precision. The coffee had helped ward off fatigue, but now I found myself more alert than I wanted to be, hyper-aware of every small sound and shadow, every shift in the rhythm of my engine, or the feel of the road beneath my wheels. The strangest part was how the cracks seemed to enhance rather than impair the mirror's function. If anything, I could see more clearly than before, the fractured surface somehow amplifying and clarifying the view behind me. I could make out details that should have been invisible in the darkness, could see the texture of the road surface, the individual fence posts along the highway's edge, even the small desert animals that occasionally darted across the asphalt in my wake. It was as if the mirror was becoming more than it had been, developing capabilities that extended beyond simple reflection. Near Barstow, I began to notice that the mirror was showing me things that weren't there. At first, I attributed it to fatigue, to the way long hours and highway hypnosis could play tricks on a driver's perception. Brief glimpses of other vehicles that vanished when I checked my side mirrors, shadows that moved independently of their sources, lights that appeared and disappeared without explanation. But as the night wore on and the web of cracks grew more intricate, these phantom images became more frequent and more detailed. I saw a motorcycle following me for miles, its headlight steady in the fractured reflection, but when I slowed to let it pass, the highway behind me remained empty. I watched a sedan pull up close to my trailer, close enough that I should have felt the turbulence of its draft, but my side mirrors showed nothing but open road. Most unsettling of all, I began to see faces in the mirror, pale and indistinct but undeniably human, appearing in the passenger seats of vehicles that cast no reflection anywhere else. The desert landscape rolled past in its moonlit vastness, all silver sage and shadow, while my CB radio carried the distant chatter of other drivers navigating their own lonely stretches of highway. I found myself reluctant to join their conversations, afraid that if I looked away from the mirror for too long, I might miss something important, some crucial detail that the fractured glass was trying to show me. The web of cracks had become incredibly complex now, covering nearly the entire surface of the mirror with a pattern so intricate it seemed almost organic, like the neural pathways of some vast electronic brain. It was outside Needles that I finally understood what the mirror was showing me. The town's lights had faded behind me, and I was climbing through a series of gentle curves that would take me toward the Colorado River when I saw my own truck in the mirror. Not the trailer I was hauling, but my entire rig, cab and all, following itself down the highway like some impossible optical loop. In the driver's seat of that phantom truck sat another version of myself, and in his rearview mirror, I could see yet another truck, another driver, stretching backward in an infinite regression of fractured reflections. The sight was so startling that I nearly swerved, my hands tightening on the steering wheel as I fought to maintain control. The engine's steady rumble seemed to deepen, taking on harmonics I'd never heard before, and the air in the cab grew thick and electric, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. I could feel my heart racing, could hear the blood rushing in my ears, but I couldn't look away from the mirror and its impossible display of parallel highways and duplicate trucks. In each reflection, I could see subtle variations. Different cargo, different weather, different times of day or night. In one, my truck was newer, painted a deep blue instead of red. In another, the highway was covered with snow that sparkled under streetlights that didn't exist in my reality. Some showed me older, some younger, some wearing different clothes or driving through landscapes I'd never seen. All of them shared the same expression of growing horror as they realized what their mirrors were showing them. The multiplying reflections began to move independently of my actions. I watched myself turn left while I drove straight, watched myself stop while I continued at highway speed, watched myself wave and gesture and mouth words I couldn't hear. The web of cracks pulsed with soft light now, each fracture line glowing like captured starlight, and I could swear I heard whispers coming from the glass itself. Voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize but somehow understood. They were all trying to warn me about something. All those other versions of myself scattered across parallel highways in parallel worlds. Their mouths moved urgently. Their hands pointed towards something I couldn't see, their eyes wide with a terror that was becoming my own. The mirror showed me dozens of them now, hundreds, each fractured section revealing another reality, another road, another driver who had encountered his own cracking mirror and begun to see too much. I realized with growing dread that I needed to stop looking, needed to break free from the mirror's hypnotic pull, before whatever had happened to those other versions of myself happened to me as well. But the effort required to look away felt enormous, as if the mirror had developed its own gravitational field, its own power to compel attention. The cracks continued to spread and multiply, and with each new fracture more realities became visible. More versions of my journey played out in ghostly reflection. The highway ahead curved through a landscape that no longer looked entirely familiar, though I'd driven this route countless times before. The mile markers seemed wrong. The exit signs advertised towns I'd never heard of, and my GPS had gone silent, its screen showing only static. In the mirror, I could see that some of the other trucks had stopped completely, their drivers slumped over their steering wheels or staring into their own fractured reflections, with expressions of complete surrender. The crying station. From Marcus, the night was thick with fog when I pulled into that godforsaken gas station somewhere outside of Bakersfield. my 18-wheeler's diesel gauge hovering just above empty. I'd been driving for 11 hours straight, chasing a delivery deadline that seemed to slip further away with each mile marker I passed. The station appeared through the mist like something from another era, its single overhead light casting sickly yellow pools across cracked asphalt. The building itself was little more than a weathered shack, with windows so grimy I couldn't see inside, and two ancient pumps that looked like they'd been standing sentinel since the 70s. I should have kept driving. Should have trusted my gut when it told me something wasn't right about this place. But the nearest truck stop was still 40 miles ahead, and I wasn't sure my old Peterbilt would make it that far on fumes. So I coasted up to the pump closest to the road, the diesel nozzle hanging from its hook like a dead snake, and shut off my engine. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the slow tick of cooling metal and the distant whisper of wind through the telephone wires overhead. The pump looked functional enough, though the digital display flickered between numbers that made no sense, cycling through prices that seemed to change every few seconds. I climbed down from the cab, my boots splashing in a puddle I hadn't noticed before, and approached the fuel island with the weary resignation of a man who'd seen too many strange things on too many lonely highways to be surprised by much anymore. The air smelled wrong, I noticed that right away. Not the usual mix of diesel fumes and road dust I was accustomed to, but something organic and cloying, like flowers left too long in standing water. I lifted the nozzle from its cradle, and that's when I heard it for the first time. A sound so faint I almost convinced myself it was just the wind, or maybe the distant hum of electrical equipment. But as I stood there in the yellow light, holding the cold metal nozzle in my hands, I could swear I heard what sounded like weeping. Soft, muffled sobs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I looked around the empty station, half expecting to see someone emerge from the shadows, but there was nothing. Just me, my truck, and that awful sound that made my skin crawl. I unscrewed my fuel cap and inserted the nozzle, telling myself that exhaustion was playing tricks on my mind. 11 hours on the road could make anyone start hearing things, right? I squeezed the handle and the pump coughed to life with a mechanical wheeze. The diesel flowed, but something was wrong with it. Even in the dim light, I could see that it wasn't the usual amber color I was used to. This fuel was darker, almost black, with an oily consistency that seemed too thick as it gurgled into my tank. And the crying got louder. It was definitely coming from the fuel itself, I realized with a growing sense of unease. Each gallon that flowed through the nozzle brought with it a sound like a child's tears, a heartbroken sobbing that made my chest tighten with an inexplicable sadness. I tried to convince myself it was just air in the lines, or some quirk of the old pump's machinery. But the sound was too human, too raw with genuine anguish to be anything mechanical. The digital readout on the pump continued its erratic cycling, the numbers changing faster now, and I noticed that the price per gallon kept climbing higher and higher, far beyond what any fuel should cost. But I couldn't seem to let go of the nozzle. My hand remained frozen on the handle, squeezing fuel that wept and moaned as it filled my tank. The sound was getting into my head now, making me think of things I'd rather forget. Lost loves, broken promises, all the roads I'd taken that had led me away from the life I'd once wanted. The fuel continued to flow, and with each passing minute, the crying grew more distinct. I could make out individual voices now, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all weeping in harmony like some horrible choir. Men, women, children, their tears mixing with the diesel that fed into my truck's hungry tank. I wanted to stop, wanted to drop the nozzle and run, but my body wouldn't obey. I stood there like a statue, watching that dark liquid pour into my truck while my soul filled up with a sadness so profound I thought it might drown me. The station attendant emerged from the building without warning, shuffling across the asphalt in worn sneakers that made no sound. He was ancient, with skin like old leather and eyes that reflected the yellow light like a nocturnal animal's. When he spoke, his voice was dry as dust and just as lifeless. "First time using our special blend?" he asked, and when he smiled, his teeth looked wet in the lamplight. It's got quite a bit more kick than regular diesel. Takes you places you never expected to go. I tried to speak to ask him what kind of fuel this was, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. The crying from the nozzle was so loud now it seemed to echo inside my skull, and I could feel tears starting to run down my own cheeks, though I couldn't say why. The old man nodded as if he understood perfectly. "That's the fuel talking," he explained, moving closer until I could smell something rotten on his breath. "Every gallon holds the essence of someone who stopped here before you. Their sorrow, their regret, all the tears they shed on the road. It makes for very efficient fuel, burns clean and gives you excellent mileage, but it does tend to affect the driver after a while." The nozzle clicked off automatically, but the crying didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, more insistent, as if the fuel in my tank was calling out to be released. The attendant shuffled around to check the pump reading, his movements unnaturally fluid in the yellow light. "That'll be everything you've got," he said, without looking at the numbers. "Cash, credit, sold, whatever you're carrying. The fuel tends to be a bit pricey, but I think you'll find it's worth every penny." I fumbled for my wallet with hands that shook uncontrollably, but when I opened it, all the bills had turned black as ink. My credit cards had warped into shapes that hurt to look at directly. Even my driver's license bore the face of someone I didn't recognize, though the name was still mine. The attendant accepted my transformed money with the casual air of someone who'd seen this transaction countless times before. "You'll want to get moving now," he advised, pocketing the blackened bills. "That fuel doesn't like to sit still for too long. It gets restless, starts looking for a way out. Best to keep driving until you find somewhere safe to stop." I climbed back into my cab with legs that felt like water, my hands trembling as I started the engine. The Peterbilt roared to life with a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard from her before. The diesel engine didn't just growl, it wailed, a sound filled with such anguish that I had to grip the steering wheel to keep from covering my ears. But the truck moved smoothly enough, pulling away from the station with a kind of eager hunger that made me nervous. In my mirrors, I watched the gas station fade into the fog, but the crying followed me. It rose from my fuel tank like a ghost, seeping through the floorboards and filling the cab with the sound of supernatural grief. Every mile I drove seemed to make it worse, as if the fuel was remembering all the sorrow it contained and sharing it with me whether I wanted it or not. The highway stretched ahead into darkness, and I realized with growing horror that I had no idea where I was going anymore. The fuel was driving now, not me, carrying me down roads that didn't appear on any map toward a destination I couldn't name. The crying filled my world, became my world, and I understood finally that I was no longer Marcus, the truck driver. I was just another voice in the fuel, another tear in the tank, waiting for the next desperate traveler to pull into that station in the fog and fill up with our collective sorrow. The road ahead disappeared into black infinity, and somewhere behind me, through the mist and darkness, I could hear the distant sound of another engine approaching that yellow light, another soul about to join our chorus of the lost. The fuel cries when touched, and now I know why. We're all still in there, dissolved in diesel and dreams, weeping for the roads we'll never take again, the beast that sleeps without silence. From Marcus, the first time I heard that old Peterbilt growl without the key even being in the ignition, I figured it was just some quirk of an aging diesel engine. After 30 years of hauling freight across the interstate system, you learn that trucks develop their own personalities, their own little habits and sounds that become as familiar as a spouse's breathing in the dark. But this sound, this low rumbling purr that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the engine bay, was different from anything I had experienced in my decades behind the wheel. I had picked up the 1987 Peterbilt 359 from a lot outside of Bakersfield, California, where the desert heat shimmers off asphalt like water and the air tastes of dust and diesel fumes. The previous owner, a weathered man named Earl with fingers stained permanent black from motor oil, had been eager to sell. Too eager, I realized later. He kept wiping sweat from his forehead even though we were standing in the shade, and his eyes never quite met mine when he handed over the keys. The truck was cherry red with chrome that gleamed like mirrors, and the price was suspiciously low for a rig in such apparent good condition. The first few weeks were blissful. The Peterbilt handled like a dream, purring through mountain passes and humming contentedly on long stretches of highway. The cab was comfortable, with worn leather seats that seemed to mold perfectly to my frame, and the engine had power to spare when climbing the steep grades of the Rockies or the Appalachians. I named her Rosie, after the color of her paint job that gleamed like fresh blood in the setting sun. It was during a layover at a truck stop outside of Amarillo, Texas, that I first noticed the strange behavior. The night was still and hot, with that oppressive humidity that makes your shirt stick to your back even when you are sitting motionless. I had shut off the engine and was settling in for my mandatory rest period, adjusting the curtains around my sleeper berth and preparing to catch a few hours of sleep before the next leg of my journey. The truck stop was relatively quiet, with only the distant hum of refrigerated trailers and the occasional rumble of a truck firing up to head back onto the interstate. That is when I heard it, a low, throaty growl that seemed to emanate from somewhere beneath me, vibrating through the floorboards and into my bones. It was not the normal settling sounds that trucks make as their engines cool down, nor was it the hydraulic hiss of air brakes or the electrical hum of onboard systems. This was something else entirely, something organic and alive, like the breathing of some massive creature lying dormant but not truly asleep. I sat up in my bunk, listening intently. The sound continued for perhaps 30 seconds, a steady rumbling purr that rose and fell in intensity like the breathing of a sleeping giant. Then it stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving only the ambient noise of the truck stop and the distant whisper of traffic on the interstate. I checked the ignition, confirming that the keys were hanging on their hook beside my bunk, nowhere near the starter. The engine was definitely off, yet something within the truck had been making that sound. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by dreams of chrome teeth and headlight eyes, of highways that stretched into infinity, and trucks that drove themselves through landscapes of bone and rust. When I awoke at dawn, golden sunlight streaming through the windshield, I almost convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Almost. But the growling returned the next night, and the night after that, always during my rest periods, always when the truck was supposed to be completely shut down. It became a routine of sorts, this mysterious rumbling that would begin sometime after midnight and continue for anywhere from a few seconds to several minutes. I started keeping a log, noting the time and duration of each episode, searching for some pattern that might explain what I was experiencing. The sound was not coming from the engine bay. I determined after several nights of careful listening. It seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating through the entire frame of the truck as if the vehicle itself was producing the noise. I checked the air system, the hydraulics, the electrical components, even the refrigeration unit on my trailer, but found nothing that could account for the mysterious growling. Other drivers at truck stops began to notice as well. During one particularly long episode at a rest area outside of Little Rock, Arkansas, a veteran driver named Sam knocked on my door, his face creased with concern and curiosity. He had been trying to sleep in the bunk of his own rig parked 3 spaces away when the sound had awakened him. "That your truck making all that noise?" he asked, glancing nervously at Rosie's gleaming chrome grille. "Sounds like you got some kind of wild animal trapped under the hood." I explained that the engine was shut off, that I had no idea what was causing the sound. Sam walked around the truck, pressing his ear to various panels and components, but could not isolate the source any better than I had. The growling stopped while he was investigating, as if whatever was producing it had become aware of his presence and decided to remain silent. "You might want to take her to a shop," Sam suggested before returning to his own truck. "That ain't normal, whatever it is." But mechanics in 3 different states could find nothing wrong with Rosie. They hooked up diagnostic computers, performed compression tests, checked every system and component they could think of, but the truck appeared to be in perfect mechanical condition. One mechanic in Tennessee, a soft-spoken man with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails, finally shook his head and wiped his hands on a red shop rag. "Mechanically speaking, this is one of the finest rigs I have ever worked on," he said, patting Rosie's fender with obvious admiration. "Engine is like new. Transmission shifts smooth as silk. Everything is exactly as it should be. If she is making the sounds you describe, well, it ain't for any reason I can diagnose." The growling grew more frequent as the weeks passed, no longer confined to my rest periods but occurring randomly throughout my drives. Sometimes it would begin while I was cruising down a lonely stretch of interstate, the rumbling so intense that I could feel it in my chest like the bass line of some massive, invisible sound system. Other times it would start just as I was pulling into a truck stop or rest area, drawing curious and sometimes frightened looks from other drivers and lot personnel. The sound began to change as well, becoming more complex and varied. Sometimes it was a low, steady purr, like a cat the size of a building expressing contentment. Other times it took on a more aggressive tone, a snarling growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up and my hands grip the steering wheel tighter. Occasionally I could swear I heard something almost like breathing within the sound. Great lungfuls of air being drawn in and expelled by something vast and unseen. It was during a night run through the mountains of West Virginia that the growling became something more than just sound. I was navigating a series of steep switchbacks, my headlights cutting through fog that clung to the mountainsides like cotton, when the rumbling began again. This time, however, I felt the steering wheel vibrate under my hands in a rhythm that did not match the sound coming from beneath me. The truck began to pull slightly to the left, then to the right, as if something was trying to wrest control of the wheel from my grasp. I downshifted and applied the brakes, looking for a place to pull over safely, but the mountain road offered no shoulder, no escape from the narrow ribbon of asphalt that wound through the darkness. The growling intensified, becoming a roar that seemed to fill the entire cab, and I felt the distinct sensation that I was no longer alone in the truck. Something large and invisible seemed to be occupying the passenger seat, its presence so tangible that I found myself glancing repeatedly to my right, expecting to see some massive shape hulking in the shadows. The truck began to accelerate on its own, the engine responding to some unseen foot pressing the accelerator pedal. My own foot was resting lightly on the brake, yet we were gaining speed as we approached a particularly sharp curve. I pressed harder on the brake pedal, but it seemed to have no effect. The speedometer climbed steadily as we hurtled toward what I knew was a guardrail and 100-foot drop into a fog-shrouded valley. At the last possible moment, just as I was certain we would crash through the barrier and plummet into the abyss, control returned to me. The invisible presence seemed to withdraw. The growling faded to silence, and my brakes suddenly responded to pressure. I managed to slow the truck and navigate the curve safely, though my hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I found a truck stop 20 miles down the mountain and pulled in, my heart still hammering in my chest like a trip hammer. The mirror's memory. From Jake Morrison. The rear-view mirror in my Peterbilt had been acting strange for weeks, but I figured it was just the mounting getting loose from all those miles of highway vibration. When you're pulling a 40-foot trailer across the Midwest in late October, you learn to ignore the little things that don't directly affect your ability to keep the rig between the ditches. The mirror would show clear skies behind me while rain hammered my windshield, or it would reflect darkness when my trailer lights clearly illuminated the road in my side mirrors. I kept meaning to tighten the adjustment screws, thinking maybe it was angled wrong, catching some weird reflection from inside the cab. That night, driving through southern Illinois on Interstate 64, the discrepancy became impossible to ignore. The weather was perfect. Clear autumn evening with stars just beginning to pierce the deepening blue sky. My CB crackled occasionally with other drivers commenting on the beautiful night, and the weather forecast had promised smooth sailing all the way to Louisville. But when I glanced up at my rearview mirror, I saw something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. Storm clouds. Massive, roiling thunderheads stretching across the entire width of the mirror, dark as spilled oil and lit from within by constant flickers of lightning. The clouds seemed to churn and twist with unnatural speed, as if time moved differently in that reflected world. I could almost feel the electricity in the air just from looking at them, though the night around me remained calm and clear. I reached up and adjusted the mirror, thinking maybe it was catching the reflection of some distant storm. But the image didn't change. No matter how I angled it, those angry clouds filled the glass, seeming to press against the surface as if trying to break through into my world. The lightning within them wasn't the typical jagged bolts you'd expect. Instead, it rolled through the darkness in sheets pulsing like a heartbeat, like something alive. The engine of my Peterbilt hummed its familiar tune, the sound that had lulled me through countless nights over the past 15 years of long-haul driving. But now, beneath that comforting rumble, I began to notice something else. A low vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. A frequency that made my teeth ache and sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't coming through the cab. It felt like it was resonating inside my skull, as if the storm in the mirror was somehow broadcasting its presence directly into my mind. I tried to focus on the road ahead, on the familiar rhythm of mile markers and exit signs, but my eyes kept drifting back to that impossible reflection. The storm was growing larger, or maybe closer, I couldn't tell which. The lightning was becoming more frequent, and with each flash I could swear I saw shapes moving within the clouds. Not the random patterns your brain tries to make sense of when staring at normal weather formations, but deliberate, purposeful movement. Something was in there riding the storm. My CB radio suddenly erupted with static, then cleared to reveal a voice I didn't recognize. The transmission was weak, fading in and out like someone broadcasting from very far away. "Storm's coming up fast behind you, driver," the voice said, crackling through the interference. "Better find somewhere to pull off and wait it out." I grabbed the handset and keyed the mic. "This is Ghost Rider eastbound at mile marker 89. I'm not seeing any storm out here, good buddy. Sky's clear as crystal." The response came immediately, but the voice sounded different now, distorted somehow, as if it were coming from underwater or through a long tunnel. "Check your mirror, driver. It's right on top of you." My blood went cold. I hadn't mentioned anything about the mirror to anyone. I looked up at the rear view again, and this time I could see rain streaking across the glass. Not my windshield, but the mirror itself. Heavy drops that seemed to be falling on the wrong side of the reflection, as if the storm was trying to break through into my reality. The lightning was constant now, strobing like a broken neon sign, and in its chaotic illumination, I could clearly see the shapes I'd only glimpsed before. They were vehicles, trucks, cars, motorcycles, an entire procession of traffic caught in that impossible storm. But they weren't driving normally. They moved in jerky, unnatural ways like marionettes being manipulated by an inexperienced puppeteer. Some of them were sideways or upside down, yet they continued moving forward with the same relentless pace. Headlights blazed through the storm, creating long streaks of light that bent and twisted like liquid fire. The vibration in my head was getting stronger, and I realized it wasn't just a sound. It was voices. Hundreds of voices, all talking at once, all trying to tell me something urgent. I couldn't make out individual words, but the tone was unmistakable. They were warning me, pleading with me, begging me to listen. I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing my rig faster than I normally would on an unfamiliar stretch of highway. The speedometer climbed past 70, then 75. The trailer behind me swayed slightly with the increased speed, but I kept my foot down. Something told me I needed to outrun whatever was building in that mirror, even though logic insisted that you can't outrun your own reflection. The storm was changing. The churning clouds were beginning to thin in places, revealing glimpses of what lay beyond them. At first I thought I was seeing stars, but as the lightning illuminated the gaps more clearly, I realized I was looking at lights, city lights, but not from any city I recognized. They formed patterns that hurt to look at directly, geometric designs that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when I wasn't focusing on them. It was as if the storm was a curtain, and something vast and impossible was moving behind it. My CB crackled again, but this time it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus of them, all speaking in unison. You can't outrun the mirror, driver. You can't outrun what's already behind you. I grabbed the handset with a shaking hand. Who is this? What do you want? The voices laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with thunder. We want you to pull over. We want you to stop. We want you to join the procession. In the mirror, the ghost traffic was moving faster now, weaving between lanes that didn't exist on any earthly highway. Some of the vehicles were close enough that I could see their occupants. Pale figures gripping steering wheels with white knuckles, their mouths open in silent screams. They were looking at me, all of them, their eyes reflecting the constant lightning like the eyes of nocturnal animals caught in headlights. The vibration in my skull was becoming unbearable, like a tuning fork being struck directly against my brain. My vision began to blur, and for a moment I lost track of which road I was on. The clear highway stretching ahead of me, or the nightmare thoroughfare in the mirror. The two seemed to be overlapping, ghostly images of the storm traffic superimposing themselves on the real world around me. That's when I saw the exit sign, a simple green rectangle announcing a rest area in 2 miles. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, a promise of solid ground and fluorescent lights and the blessed ordinariness of picnic tables and vending machines. I began steering toward the right lane, my turn signal clicking like a metronome, counting down the seconds until I could escape whatever was pursuing me. But as I moved to the right, something impossible happened. The ghost vehicles in the mirror began changing lanes too, matching my movements exactly. They were following me, staying directly behind me no matter where I went. Worse, they were getting closer. What had been distant headlights in the storm were now clearly visible as individual trucks and cars, their details becoming more distinct with each passing second. I could see rust patterns on their bodies, license plates from states and years that didn't match anything logical. One truck looked exactly like mine, down to the specific arrangement of lights and chrome. But its paint was faded and peeling as if it had been abandoned for decades. The driver was wearing the same flannel shirt I had on, but his face was obscured by shadows that moved independently of the lightning. The exit ramp appeared ahead of me like a lifeline, and I took it fast, my trailer swaying as we curved away from the main highway. I didn't slow down until I reached the rest area parking lot, where I pulled into the first available space and killed the engine. The sudden silence was overwhelming after hours of road noise, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and my own ragged breathing. I sat there for several minutes, afraid to look in the mirror, afraid to confirm whether the storm had followed me off the highway. Finally, I gathered enough courage to glance up at the rear view. It showed exactly what it should have. The rear of my trailer, the empty parking lot, the dark trees beyond. Normal, real, safe. The highway that runs backward. From Marcus Delacroix, you spend enough years behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler, and you learn to trust your internal clock more than any timepiece. Your body knows when it's 3 a.m. by the way your shoulders settle, when dawn approaches by the subtle shift in your breathing. After 22 years hauling freight across these endless ribbons of asphalt, I thought I knew every trick the road could play on a tired mind. I was wrong about that, and I learned it the hard way on a stretch of Interstate 47 that doesn't appear on any current map. It started on a Tuesday night in late October, somewhere between Millfield and Cedar Junction. I was running a load of electronics bound for Chicago, my Peterbilt 379 humming its familiar diesel lullaby as the white lines swept beneath my headlights like a hypnotic pulse. The CB radio crackled with the usual chatter of night drivers seeking company in the darkness, but gradually the voices faded as I rolled deeper into rural territory, where the cell towers grew sparse and the radio signals thin. Rain had begun to fall an hour earlier, not the aggressive downpour that demands your full attention, but that steady, Persistent drizzle that turns the windshield into a canvas of constantly shifting water droplets. My wipers moved in their methodical rhythm, squeaking slightly on the upstroke. A sound I kept meaning to fix but never quite got around to. The heater hummed softly, fighting off the October chill that seeped through the cab's weather stripping. And somewhere in that cocoon of familiar sounds and sensations, I realized I had been driving for much longer than I remembered. I glanced at the digital clock on my dashboard and felt the first stirring of unease. It read 2:47 a.m., but I could have sworn it had shown the same time when I last checked, maybe 30 miles back. The green numerals seemed to pulse slightly in my peripheral vision, though when I looked directly at them they appeared perfectly steady. I rubbed my eyes, attributing the oddity to road fatigue, and reached for the thermos of coffee wedged between my seat and the center console. The coffee was still warm, which struck me as strange since I had poured it hours ago at a truck stop near Millfield. Steam rose from the cup as I sipped, and the bitter taste that should have been familiar carried an undertone I couldn't identify. Something metallic and slightly sweet, like pennies dissolved in honey. Outside my side window, the landscape rolled past in the darkness, an endless procession of skeletal trees and empty fields punctuated by the occasional farmhouse, window glowing yellow against the night. It was then that I noticed the mile markers were counting, backward. At first I thought I was misreading them in the rain and darkness, but as I passed marker after marker, the reality became undeniable. Mile 247, then 246, then 245. Each one clearly lit in my headlights for the brief moment before it vanished into the darkness behind me. According to my GPS, I was still heading north toward Chicago, but the mile markers insisted I was traveling in the opposite direction, back toward territory I had already covered. I pulled out my phone to check my location, but the screen showed no signal, not even the usual single bar I typically maintained in remote areas. The GPS unit mounted on my dashboard showed my truck as a blue dot moving steadily along Interstate 47, but the map around me appeared strangely sparse, lacking the usual details of towns, rest stops, and cross streets. It was as if I was traveling through a simplified version of the world, a rough sketch rather than the detailed reality I knew. The CB radio had fallen completely silent, not even the static that usually fills empty channels. I tried calling out, my voice sounding oddly muffled in the cab. "Breaker 19, this is Iron Horse looking for a radio check. Anybody got ears on?" Nothing came back except the hollow echo of my own words, as if they were bouncing off the inside of the cab, rather than transmitting anywhere at all. Mile marker 243 swept past, then 242, then 241, and with each passing sign I felt a growing certainty that something fundamental had shifted in the world around me. The rain continued its steady percussion on the roof, but the sound seemed to be coming from farther away, as if the drops were falling through a greater distance before striking the metal. The engine's rumble, normally felt as much as heard through the driver's seat, had taken on a hollow quality, like an echo of itself. I began to notice details in the landscape that shouldn't have been there. A red barn that I was certain hadn't existed when I passed this way earlier stood silhouetted against the lightning-flickered sky, its paint so vivid it seemed to glow in the darkness. Stone walls ran alongside the highway where I remembered only wire fencing, and the trees appeared taller, older, their branches reaching across the roadway like gnarled fingers seeking to touch something just beyond their grasp. The clock on my dashboard still read 2:47. And dead as mile marker 240 appeared and vanished, I saw the first of the other vehicles. A sedan passed me going in the opposite direction, its headlights cutting through the rain straight toward Chicago. For a moment, our vehicles were parallel, and I looked down into the other car hoping to see a familiar sight. Another person sharing this strange stretch of road, but the driver's seat appeared empty, though the steering wheel turned smoothly to follow the curves of the highway. More vehicles began to appear, all heading in the opposite direction, all apparently unmanned. A pickup truck with its radio playing loud enough that I could hear the music through both our closed windows, though the cab appeared vacant. A minivan with children's toys visible on the dashboard but no sign of a driver's silhouette. An RV with lights glowing warm and yellow in its windows, giving the impression of occupancy, but again no visible driver guiding it through the night. I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white in the dashboard's green glow. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, and I began to suspect that if I continued driving, I might pass mile marker after mile marker counting backward until they reached zero. And then what? What lay beyond the beginning of this road that seemed to be unwinding itself beneath my wheels? It was then that I saw the truck stop ahead, its neon sign flickering against the darkness like a beacon. Rosie's 24-hour diner, the sign proclaimed, though the letters seemed to shimmer and shift as I watched, sometimes appearing to spell entirely different words before resolving back to their original message. I had never seen this establishment before. Was certain it hadn't existed on my earlier passage through this area, but after hours of increasingly surreal driving, even an impossible truck stop felt like a refuge. I guided my rig into the parking lot, noting that several other trucks were already there, their running lights creating small pools of red and amber in the rain-soaked darkness. As I set my air brakes and began to shut down for what I hoped would be a brief rest, I noticed that none of the other trucks showed any signs of recent operation. No steam rose from their exhaust stacks, no engine noise disturbed the night, and their windshields were covered with a layer of rain, droplets that suggested they had been sitting motionless for much longer than the few minutes it might take for a driver to grab a cup of coffee and a sandwich. The diner itself glowed with warm light, and through the windows I could see the familiar shapes of booth seating and a counter with stools, but no movement of customers or staff. The neon sign continued its irregular flicker, and I realized that the light it cast was slightly the wrong color. Not the honest red and blue of normal neon, but something that hurt to look at directly, something that made my eyes water and my vision blur around the edges. I sat in my cab for several minutes, listening to my engine tick as it cooled, trying to decide whether to investigate the diner or simply try to sleep until dawn. The clock still read 2:47 a.m., and I began to wonder if dawn would ever come to this place where time seemed to have gotten stuck like a record with a scratch, playing the same moment over and over. That's when I saw him walking across the parking lot toward my truck, a figure in a rain slicker that reflected my headlights with an oily sheen. He moved with purpose, his face hidden beneath the hood, and something about his gait made my skin crawl. He walked as if he were moving through water, each step taking slightly too long, his arms swinging in a rhythm that was almost but not quite human. I started my engine immediately, not waiting to see what he wanted or who he might be. The diesel roared to life with a sound I had never been so happy to hear, and I released the brakes and pulled forward just as the figure reached the spot where my trailer had been parked. In my side mirror, I saw him stop and turn to watch me leave, and though I couldn't see his face beneath the hood, I had the distinct impression that he was smiling. The Correspondence Highway. From Marcus. The first letter appeared on my dashboard on a Tuesday night somewhere between Barstow and Bakersfield, fluttering against my windshield like a pale moth before sliding through the gap where my driver's side window didn't quite seal properly. I'd been meaning to fix that seal for months, but long-haul trucking doesn't leave much time for maintenance that isn't absolutely critical. The desert wind had been howling for hours, carrying dust and tumbleweeds across Highway 58, and I figured it was just another piece of roadside litter that had found its way into my cab. My Peterbilt's engine hummed its familiar diesel lullaby as I reached for the cream-colored envelope, noting how clean it looked despite having presumably blown across miles of desert wasteland. The paper felt expensive between my fingers, heavier than regular stationery with an almost silk-like texture that seemed to absorb the heat from my calloused hands. There was no return address, no postmark. Just my name written across the front in elegant script that looked like it had been penned with an old fountain pen. Marcus Holloway, not my CB handle, Not the name on my commercial license, but my full legal name that I rarely used anymore. The wind outside picked up again, rocking my 18-wheeler slightly as I pulled over at a rest stop, illuminated by a few flickering sodium lights that cast everything in an amber glow. The letter opener on my keychain made quick work of the envelope's seal, and I unfolded what appeared to be a single sheet of the same heavy paper. The message was brief, written in that same flowing script that seemed to dance in the uncertain light. It read simply, "The wind remembers every word never spoken. Some conversations echo across years, waiting for the right moment to reach their intended destination. This is the first of many messages that should have found you long ago." I read the words 3 times, turning the paper over to check for additional text or some kind of explanation, but found only blank space. The rational part of my mind suggested it was some kind of marketing gimmick, or perhaps a case of mistaken identity, but something about the letter felt deeply personal, as if it had been written specifically for me by someone who knew things about my life that I'd never shared with another soul. The wind continued to howl outside, and I found myself glancing nervously at the gap in my windowsill, half expecting another envelope to materialize. The second letter arrived 3 days later as I was crossing through Kansas wheat fields that stretched endlessly under a star-filled sky. This time I saw it coming, watching a white rectangle tumble through the air before sliding through that same gap with an almost deliberate precision. My hands trembled slightly as I opened this new correspondence, noting that the paper and handwriting were identical to the first. The message was longer this time, more specific. "Do you remember the promise you made to Sarah before she moved away in 7th grade? You said you'd write letters every week, but you never sent a single one. She waited by her mailbox every day for months. The wind collected all those unwritten words, every apology and confession that you composed in your head, but never put to paper. Sarah Henderson." I hadn't thought about her in decades, but the memory came flooding back with startling clarity. She'd been my first real crush, the girl with strawberry blonde hair who sat 2 seats ahead of me in Mrs. Patterson's English class. When her father got transferred to Oregon, I'd promised to stay in touch, had even bought a pack of stationery with my allowance money. But I'd been 13 and scared, paralyzed by the fear that my letters wouldn't be interesting enough or that she'd find my handwriting childish. Week after week, I'd started letters that never got finished, apologies that never got sent, declarations of young love that remained trapped in my adolescent heart. The third letter found me in Louisiana Bayou country, where Spanish moss hung from cypress trees like ghostly curtains, and the night air was thick with humidity and the smell of stagnant water. By now, I'd developed a strange anticipation for these mysterious deliveries, checking my windowsill obsessively and watching the sky for any sign of approaching correspondence. This letter was different, though. The handwriting appeared more hurried, the elegant script showing signs of emotional urgency. "Your father tried to write you a letter before he died. He wanted to explain why he worked so many double shifts, why he missed your baseball games and school plays. He wanted you to know that every extra hour at the factory was motivated by love, by his desperate desire to save enough money for your college fund." The letter is still in his desk drawer, unfinished. The wind whispers his words every night. I had to pull over completely this time, my vision blurred by tears I hadn't shed in years. Dad had passed away from a heart attack when I was 19, and I'd spent the better part of 2 decades resenting him for never being around during my childhood. The idea that he'd been planning to reach out to explain himself opened wounds that I'd thought had healed long ago. I found myself wondering who could possibly know such intimate details about my family history. But deep down I was beginning to suspect that the answer lay somewhere beyond the realm of ordinary human knowledge. The NASU letters continued to arrive with increasing frequency as I traveled my routes across the continental United States. Each one revealed another missed connection, another conversation that should have happened but never did. There was the letter my high school girlfriend Jennifer had written, but never sent when I left for trucking school. explaining that she'd wanted to wait for me despite the long distances and uncertain schedule. There was the apology my estranged brother had composed after our fight over Dad's funeral arrangements, pages of regret and attempts at reconciliation that he'd deleted from his computer without ever sending. There was the thank you note from Mrs. Chen, my elderly neighbor, who had wanted to express her gratitude for the times I'd quietly shoveled her driveway without being asked, but who had been too proud to acknowledge her need for help. Each letter felt like a weight being lifted from my shoulders, and simultaneously, like a new burden being placed there. The wind that delivered these messages had become my constant companion, following my truck across desert highways and mountain passes, through forests and prairies, always finding that gap in my windowsill with supernatural accuracy. I stopped trying to fix the seal, had even begun leaving the window slightly cracked to make the deliveries easier. But it was the letter that arrived during a thunderstorm in the Appalachian Mountains that changed everything. The rain was coming down in sheets and lightning illuminated the dark hollows between the hills with brief, ghostly flashes. This envelope was different from the others, sealed with what appeared to be black wax and heavier than anything I'd received before. The handwriting on the front was barely legible, as if written by someone whose strength was failing. This will be the last letter the wind can carry to you. The connections are weakening, and the energy required to bridge these gaps grows stronger each time. But there is one final message that must be delivered. One piece of correspondence that could change the trajectory of your future, if you're willing to listen. Inside, written on several sheets of that same heavy paper, was a letter from my own future self. The handwriting was unmistakably mine, though aged and shaky, and it described a life of continued solitude and regret if I didn't learn from these supernatural revelations. It warned me about the accident that would happen in 6 months if I continued driving, while preoccupied with loneliness and past mistakes. It urged me to reach out to my brother, to call Jennifer, to write the letters that I should have written decades ago, but somehow still had time to send. The strangest part was the final paragraph, which seemed to shift and change as I read it, the words rearranging themselves on the page. The wind has been patient, but its job is nearly done. Choose carefully how you respond to this gift of insight. Some letters need to be written in order to break the cycle of missed connections that has defined your existence. Others need to be received. Check your post office box tomorrow, Marcus. Some correspondence travels by more conventional means. When I reached the next town, I called the post office where I'd maintained a box for years but rarely checked. The clerk confirmed that I had several pieces of mail waiting, some of them quite old. Among them was a letter from Sarah, postmarked just 2 weeks ago, explaining how she'd tracked down my mailing address through a private investigator. She was divorced now, living in Oregon still, and remembered our childhood promise with surprising fondness. She wondered if I might be interested in corresponding, in finally exchanging those letters we'd never written all those years ago. The wind still follows my truck sometimes, but the mysterious deliveries have stopped. The gap in my windowsill remains unfixed just in case, but these days I find myself writing letters instead of waiting for them to arrive. I've discovered that some conversations are never too late to begin, and some connections can be restored with nothing more than the courage to put pen to paper and trust that the words will find their way to where they need to go. The gurgling call from Marcus Holloway. The first time I heard that horn, I thought it was just another trucker with a busted air system, nothing more than a mechanical hiccup on the endless stretch of Interstate 80 that cuts through Nevada's heart like a silver scar. I'd been running freight for 17 years, hauling everything from furniture to farm equipment across this country's veins of asphalt, and you learn to recognize every sound the road throws at you. The diesel rumble of a Peterbilt climbing grade, the whistle of wind through a poorly sealed trailer door, the distant wail of sirens that make you check your mirrors twice. But this sound, this wet, bubbling noise that barely resembled a horn at all, was something entirely new. It was just past 2 in the morning when I first heard it. That dead hour when the highway belongs to us night haulers and the occasional insomniac, fleeing ghosts in their rear-view mirrors. My Kenworth T680 was humming along at a steady 70, her chrome stacks singing their familiar diesel lullaby, while the CB chattered with the usual mix of weather reports and lonely voices seeking connection across the dark miles. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly on both sides, a moonlit wasteland of sage and shadow punctuated by the occasional cluster of lights that marked another truck stop oasis in the commercial wilderness. That's when I heard it behind me, carried on the night wind that swept across the cab through my slightly cracked window. At first I thought it might be some kind of animal, perhaps a coyote with something caught in its throat. But the sound had a mechanical undertone, a rhythmic quality that spoke of human intention. It was like someone trying to blow a horn while gargling water, a liquid choking noise that made my skin crawl in ways I couldn't quite explain. The sound came again, closer now, and I glanced at my side mirror to see headlights approaching from behind, still distant but gaining ground with surprising speed. The other truck pulled alongside me about 10 minutes later, and in the wash of my running lights, I could make out the silhouette of an old Freightliner, probably from the 80s, its boxy cab and long hood marking it as one of those classics that some drivers refuse to retire. The paint job was hard to make out in the darkness, but it seemed to be a deep blue or black, with chrome that caught and scattered light in strange patterns. What struck me most was how quiet it ran. My own engine filled the cab with its steady rumble, but this other truck seemed to glide beside me with barely a whisper, as if it were floating rather than rolling on 18 wheels. As we ran parallel through the desert night, I tried to get a look at the driver, but the cab was dark. No dome light or dashboard glow to illuminate the interior. The truck matched my speed exactly, staying perfectly aligned with my trailer for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. I reached for my CB microphone, thinking I'd try to raise the other driver. Maybe ask about road conditions ahead or just exchange the kind of casual conversation that helps pass the long miles. Before I could key the mic, though, that horn sounded again, much closer now, and the liquid quality of it sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the desert's nighttime cold. The sound wasn't coming from the truck beside me, I realized with growing unease. It was coming from somewhere ahead, drifting back to us on the wind like a sick call across the wasteland. The Freightliner beside me seemed to shiver slightly, though that might have been a trick of the shifting shadows cast by our combined headlights. Then, without warning, it began to pull ahead, accelerating smoothly into the darkness while I maintained my steady cruise control speed. I watched its taillights grow smaller, twin red eyes that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm rather than maintaining the steady glow I expected. Miles passed in their usual hypnotic succession, the white lines disappearing under my hood like a stream of consciousness made manifest in paint and asphalt. The CB had gone quiet except for the occasional burst of static, and even that seemed muted, as if the radio waves themselves were reluctant to travel far in this particular stretch of desert. I found myself checking my fuel gauge more often than usual, though I knew I had plenty to reach the next truck stop. Something about the night felt wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on what exactly had changed. That's when I saw the Freightliner again, or thought I did. It was parked on the shoulder about a mile ahead, hazard lights flashing in a slow, irregular pattern that made my eyes water if I looked directly at them. As I approached, I could see that the truck's hood was raised, suggesting mechanical trouble, and years of road courtesy demanded that I at least slow down and ask if help was needed. I eased off the throttle and began to drift toward the shoulder, my air brakes hissing softly as the big rig settled into a lower speed. But as I drew closer, something about the scene struck me as fundamentally wrong. The truck was there, certainly, its bulk clearly visible in my headlights, but it seemed somehow insubstantial, as if I were looking at it through water or heat shimmer. The flashing hazard lights cast no reflection on the desert floor, and the raised hood revealed not an engine compartment, but a darkness so complete it seemed to absorb light rather than simply lacking it. Most disturbing of all, I could hear that gurgling horn again, and now I was certain it was coming from the disabled truck. though the sound seemed to emerge not from any specific location, but from the vehicle as a whole, as if the entire machine were somehow producing that wet, choking noise. I pulled back into the travel lane and pressed the accelerator, suddenly eager to put distance between myself and whatever was masquerading as a broken-down truck on the desert shoulder. In my mirror, I watched the scene shrink away, but the hazard lights continued to flash their irregular pattern long after they should have disappeared beyond the horizon. The gurgling horn sounded once more, longer this time, and I could swear I heard something else mixed in with that liquid noise. Something that might have been a voice calling out words I couldn't quite distinguish. The next truck stop was still 30 miles ahead according to my GPS, but I found myself counting down every mile marker with increasing desperation. The night that had seemed peaceful and routine just an hour earlier now felt heavy with malevolent possibility, as if the darkness beyond my headlight beams concealed threats that my rational mind refused to acknowledge, but my instincts recognized with growing alarm. I turned up the CB volume hoping to hear another human voice, but found only static that rose and fell with the same rhythm as that horrible horn. When I finally saw the truck stop's neon signs bleeding color into the desert night, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I had been holding. The Flying J's familiar logo looked like a beacon of normality, promising coffee that had been brewing too long and the comfortable sounds of other drivers going about their mundane business of fuel and food and restroom breaks. I pulled into the lot and found a parking spot near the building, close enough to the other trucks that their presence felt like protection against whatever strangeness I'd encountered out on the dark highway. But as I shut down the engine and prepared to climb down from the cab, I heard it one more time, that gurgling horn drifting across the truck stop lot like a question mark made of sound. I looked around quickly, scanning the ranks of parked trucks for any sign of the old Freightliner, but saw only the usual collection of modern rigs and a few older models that bore no resemblance to the mysterious truck I'd encountered. The other drivers going about their business showed no sign of having heard anything unusual, continuing their conversations and maintenance checks as if the night held nothing more threatening than the possibility of running behind schedule. I never did figure out what I heard out there in the Nevada desert, though I've run that same stretch of I-80 dozens of times since then. Sometimes in the deep hours of the night when the highway belongs to shadows in the spaces between radio stations, I think I hear it again. That wet, choking sound that might be a horn or might be something else entirely. Something that uses the familiar language of the road to communicate intentions that have nothing to do with signaling lane changes or warning of hazards ahead. I've learned to turn up my music when I hear it now, and to keep my eyes fixed firmly on the white lines that lead toward whatever destination waits beyond the next horizon, because some questions are better left unanswered, and some calls are better left unreturned. The Luminous Load. From Marcus Chen. The thing about driving freight across the Pacific Northwest is that you learn to expect the unexpected. But nothing prepared me for what I picked up that foggy October evening in Portland. Rain had been threatening all day, those heavy gray clouds hanging low like a funeral shroud over the Columbia River, and I could smell the moisture in the air through my slightly cracked window as I backed my Peterbilt up to the loading dock of Meridian. Logistics. The warehouse sat in one of those industrial districts where legitimate businesses rub shoulders with operations you don't ask too many questions about. All concrete and corrugated steel under flickering sodium lights that cast everything in sickly yellow. I'd been hauling for Meridian for 3 years, mostly routine stuff, pharmaceuticals and electronics, the kind of cargo that paid well enough to keep my questions to myself and my manifest signed without much scrutiny. The dock supervisor that night was someone I'd never seen before. A thin man in his 50s with prematurely white hair and eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. He handed me the paperwork with hands that trembled slightly. Whether from cold or nerves, I couldn't tell. And when I asked about the delivery schedule, he just nodded toward my trailer and said the cargo needed to reach the research facility outside Spokane before dawn. 3 pallets, each wrapped in what looked like standard black plastic sheeting. secured with more strapping than seemed necessary, and marked with biohazard symbols that made me pause. The supervisor noticed my hesitation and assured me it was just a precaution, some kind of mineral samples that required careful handling. Nothing dangerous as long as the containers remained sealed. The pay was double my usual rate for a cross-state haul, and with winter coming on, and my daughter's college tuition due, I didn't press for details. The first drops of rain began hitting my windshield as I pulled away from the dock, each one catching the light from passing street lamps like tiny prisms. My CB crackled with the usual chatter from other drivers, warnings about construction zones and speed traps, the comfortable rhythm of voices that made the long, lonely miles bearable. The engine of my Peterbilt hummed its familiar tune, that steady diesel heartbeat that had carried me across 500,000 miles without major trouble. By the time I reached the interstate, the rain had settled into a steady downpour, the kind that makes the pavement shine like black glass and turns the world beyond your headlights into a shifting wall of darkness. I'd driven in worse weather, but something felt different tonight, an electric tension in the air that made my skin prickle and the hair on my arm stand up. I attributed it to the approaching storm front and settled in for what I expected to be a routine 6-hour drive through the Cascade foothills. It was somewhere past Troutdale, climbing through the forested mountains with rain hammering my windshield like angry fists, that I first noticed the glow in my mirrors. At first I thought it might be another truck behind me, headlights cutting through the storm, but when I checked there was nothing there except the wet asphalt unwinding into darkness. The glow seemed to be coming from my own trailer, a soft blue-green radiance that pulsed gently like a slow heartbeat, visible through the gaps where the trailer doors didn't quite meet. I pulled over at the next truck stop, a lonely outpost called Miller's Rest that squatted beside the highway like a neon island in an ocean of pine trees. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a couple of sleeper cabs and a rusted-out pickup truck that looked like it hadn't moved in years. Rain drummed steadily on my cab roof as I sat there, engine idling, trying to decide what to do. The smart thing would be to call dispatch, report a possible problem with the cargo. But something held me back. Maybe the memory of that supervisor's nervous hands or the fact that my phone showed no signal bars in this remote stretch of mountains. I grabbed my flashlight and rain slicker and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit me immediately, that bone-deep chill that comes with Pacific Northwest rain, and within seconds water was running down my neck despite the weather gear. I walked slowly around to the back of my trailer, the beam of my flashlight creating a small cone of visibility in the downpour, and what I saw made me stop breathing for a moment. The entire trailer was glowing, that same soft blue-green light I'd seen in my mirrors, but much brighter now, bright enough to illuminate the rain falling around it like drops of liquid starlight. The light seemed to pulse from within the cargo itself, radiating through the metal walls of the trailer as if they were made of tinted glass instead of steel. I could hear something too, barely audible above the drumming of rain, a low harmonic vibration that seemed to resonate in my chest cavity. My hands shook as I fumbled for the trailer doors, though whether from cold or fear I couldn't say. The locking mechanism felt oddly warm to the touch, almost hot. And when I finally got the doors open, the light that spilled out was bright enough to make me shield my eyes. The 3 pallets sat exactly where they'd been loaded, but the black plastic wrapping had become translucent, like dark water, and through it I could see the containers inside, sleek metal cylinders that glowed with an inner fire. The rain that fell into the open trailer began to glow as soon as it touched the plastic wrapping, each droplet becoming a tiny point of blue-green light that ran down the sides of the pallets like luminous tears. The harmonic vibration grew stronger, and I realized it was coming from the containers themselves, as if whatever was inside them was singing in frequencies that human ears could barely detect. I should have closed the doors and driven straight back to Portland, should have demanded answers from Meridian Logistics about what exactly I was carrying through the mountains in a raging storm. Instead, I found myself stepping up into the trailer, drawn by a curiosity that felt both compelling and completely alien to my normal cautious nature. The air inside was warm despite the open doors, charged with an energy that made my skin tingle and my vision seem unnaturally sharp. As I moved closer to the nearest pallet, I could see that the metal container inside wasn't just glowing, it was moving, shifting and flowing like liquid mercury, while maintaining its basic cylindrical shape. Symbols appeared and disappeared on its surface, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if they existed in more dimensions than my eyes were equipped to process. The singing grew louder, harmonizing with itself in impossible ways, and I realized that the three containers were communicating with each other, sharing information or energy through frequencies that turned the rain itself into a conductor. That's when I heard the truck engines, multiple diesels approaching fast from both directions on the highway. I looked out from the trailer to see headlights cutting through the rain, at least 4 vehicles converging on the truck stop, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested this wasn't a coincidence. My CB radio crackled to life with voices using call signs I didn't recognize, terse communications about containment and retrieval that made my blood run cold. I slammed the trailer doors shut and ran for my cab, rain-soaked and shaking, the glow from the cargo still visible through the metal walls like some kind of supernatural beacon. The engine fired up immediately, thank God, and I pulled out of the truck stop just as the first of the pursuing vehicles entered the parking lot. In my mirrors, I could see them spreading out, professional and methodical, and I knew with absolute certainty that they hadn't come to help me with a freight problem. The next hour was the longest of my driving career, a nightmare chase through mountain curves and switchbacks with the storm intensifying and my cargo growing brighter with each mile. The pursuing vehicles stayed just far enough back to remain barely visible in my mirrors, but I could sense them there, pacing me like wolves, waiting for the right moment to close the trap. The containers in my trailer sang louder now, their harmonies creating complex interference patterns in my radio that made normal communication impossible. Somewhere near government camp, with dawn still hours away and my fuel gauge dropping toward the danger zone, I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of continuing toward Spokane as my manifest directed, I took a logging road that branched off into the deep forest, a narrow ribbon of gravel and mud that climbed up into the mountains where the old growth still stood like ancient cathedral pillars. For 20 minutes, I drove through darkness so complete that my headlights seemed to be swallowed by the trees, the glow from my cargo providing more illumination than the storm-filtered moon. Finally, I reached a clearing, a small meadow where loggers had worked decades ago, and I stopped the truck and waited. The rain continued to fall, but softer now, and each drop that touched my trailer glowed briefly before fading, creating a constellation of tiny lights that danced across the metal surfaces. The pursuing vehicles never found me there in that hidden clearing, though I could hear them sometimes on distant roads, engines growling through the forest like mechanical predators. The voice that follows. From Danny Kowalski. The CB radio crackled to life just as I was settling into the long stretch between Amarillo and Oklahoma City, the kind of empty highway that makes you grateful for any human voice cutting through the darkness. I'd been hauling refrigerated goods for the better part of 15 years, and that old Cobra CB mounted above my dash had been my companion through countless lonely nights. The amber glow of its display was as familiar as the rumble of my Peterbilt's engine, a constant presence that made the endless miles feel just a little less isolating. Breaker 19. This is Moondog rolling eastbound on the 40. Anyone got their ears on out there? The voice that responded was immediately distinctive, not just for its gravelly tone, but for something else that made the hair on my arms stand up. After each sentence, there was this laugh, soft at first, like pebbles rattling in a tin can. Well, hello there, eastbound driver. This is Rattlesnake Jake, and I'm running parallel to your route, keeping you company through this beautiful dark night. The laugh came again, longer this time, that strange rattling quality more pronounced. It wasn't quite human, wasn't quite mechanical, but something caught between the two like old bones shaking in a leather bag. Still, After hours of nothing but static and distant trucker chatter from hundreds of miles away, I was grateful for the conversation. The night had been unusually quiet, with that heavy silence that seems to press against your eardrums and make every shadow on the highway seem to shift and move with purpose. Good to hear another voice out here. Rattlesnake Jake. This is Moondog running a reefer unit bound for Tulsa. Been nothing but ghost towns and tumbleweeds for the last 100 miles. I adjusted my mirror and glanced at the CB, watching the green transmission light flicker with each word. What you hauling tonight? The response came with that laugh threading through every pause. Oh, I'm carrying precious cargo tonight, Moondog. Very precious indeed. The rattling sound stretched out, seeming to echo longer than the confines of radio transmission should allow. Been following the same route as you for quite some time now, actually. Amazing how two trucks can run so close together in this vast darkness and never quite see each other. Something about that statement made me check my mirrors more carefully. The highway behind me stretched empty under the pale moonlight. Nothing but asphalt and the occasional reflective road marker catching my taillights. Ahead, the road curved gently through rolling hills dotted with scrub brush and the skeletal remains of old fence posts. No headlights anywhere, no running lights, no sign of another 18-wheeler sharing this lonely stretch of interstate. Funny thing, I said into the handset, I haven't seen another truck out here for the better part of an hour. You running dark tonight, Jake? It wasn't uncommon for drivers to kill their running lights to save battery, though it wasn't exactly legal on the interstate. That rattling laugh filled the cab again, longer and more unsettling than before. Dark is relative, my friend. Some of us see just fine without lights, have been navigating these roads longer than you might imagine. There was a pause, filled with static that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. Tell me, Moondog, do you ever feel like you're being watched out there? Like something is keeping pace with you, just beyond the reach of your headlights? The question sent an uncomfortable chill down my spine. Truth was, I had been feeling exactly that for the past 50 miles. Ever since I'd passed that abandoned truck stop with its broken neon sign flickering against the darkness. There had been something about that place, the way the shadows seemed too deep, too complete, as if they were swallowing light rather than simply existing in its absence. Since then, I'd been checking my mirrors obsessively, certain I could sense some presence keeping pace with my rig. Can't say that I do. I lied, not wanting to feed into whatever strange mood had settled over this conversation. Just another night on the road far as I'm concerned. The laugh that followed was different this time, not just rattling but somehow knowing, as if Jake could see right through my words to the unease beneath. Of course. We all tell ourselves these little stories to make the darkness more manageable, but between you and me, driver to driver, haven't you noticed how empty the road has been tonight? No other traffic, no highway patrol, no late-night commuters heading home from swing shifts. Just you and me and all this beautiful emptiness. He was right, and that realization made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. Now that he mentioned it, I couldn't remember seeing any other vehicles for hours. Even the most desolate stretches of highway usually had some traffic. Someone else burning diesel and chasing deadlines through the small hours of the morning. But tonight it was as if the road belonged entirely to us, stretching endlessly through a world that felt increasingly disconnected from the familiar rhythms of interstate commerce. Maybe it's just a slow night, I suggested, though my voice sounded unconvincing even to myself. Happens sometimes, especially on these smaller routes. Oh, but Moondog, Jake's voice crackled through the speaker with that terrible rattling laugh weaving through each word. This isn't a small route at all. This is a very important road, a road that many travelers have used over the years. Some of them are still using it, in fact, still running their routes night after night, year after year. The laughter seemed to echo from multiple directions now, not just from the CB, but somehow from the darkness outside my windows. I reached for the squelch control, wondering if atmospheric conditions were causing some kind of strange echo effect. But the adjustment didn't change the unsettling quality of Jake's transmission. If anything, his voice seemed clearer now, more present, as if he were somehow getting closer despite the empty highway stretching in all directions. "Jake, I'm having trouble with your signal," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, getting some strange interference on my end. "Maybe we should check back in a few miles when the conditions clear up." "Oh, there's no interference, my friend. You're hearing me exactly as I am, exactly as I've always been." That rattling laugh filled the cab again, and now I was certain it wasn't coming entirely from the radio. It seemed to be surrounding my truck, emanating from the darkness itself. In fact, I think it's time we met properly. I've been looking forward to this conversation for such a long time. My blood turned to ice water as I checked my mirrors again and saw them. Not headlights, not the familiar glow of running lights or clearance markers, but two dim red points following behind me, keeping perfect pace with my rig despite my steady 70-mile-per-hour speed. They weren't reflecting light. They were generating it, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the cadence of Jake's horrible laughter. "What do you want?" I asked, abandoning any pretense of normalcy. My foot found the accelerator, pushing my Peterbilt harder, but those red lights maintained their distance effortlessly, never falling behind, never drawing closer, just maintaining that perfect, impossible spacing. "Want?" Jake's voice was clearer now than any CB transmission had a right to be, cutting through the static with razor precision. "I don't want anything, Moondog. I'm simply doing what I've always done, running my route, keeping other drivers company through the long, dark hours. Some conversations last minutes, some last hours, and some last much longer than that." The rattling laugh that followed seemed to shake my entire truck, vibrating through the chassis and up through the steering wheel. Outside, the landscape began to change, the familiar scrub brush and rolling hills giving way to terrain I didn't recognize, despite having run this route dozens of times. The road markers I passed bore numbers that made no sense, mile markers that seemed to count backward toward some destination I couldn't identify. Panic rising in my throat, I grabbed the handset again. "Listen, Jake, or whatever you are, I don't know what kind of game this is, but I've got a delivery to make. I need to get off this frequency and focus on the road." "But this is the road, my friend." The laughter rattled through the cab like dried bones in a box, growing louder and more intense. "This is the only road that matters now, and we have so much more to discuss. Tell me about all those other nights, all those other routes, all those times you felt something watching from just beyond your headlights. You felt me before, haven't you? Following, waiting, choosing just the right moment for us to finally talk." The terrible truth was that he was right. There had been other nights, other stretches of highway where I'd felt that presence keeping pace with my rig, had caught glimpses of those red lights in my peripheral vision, had heard fragments of that rattling laugh carried on the wind. The singing steel, from Marcus. The interstate stretched ahead like a black ribbon under the pale moonlight, and I should have been grateful for the clear weather after 3 days of rain that had turned every mile into a white-knuckle fight against hydroplaning. My Peterbilt 389 hummed its familiar diesel lullaby, the kind of sound that usually helped me settle into the rhythm of another long haul from Portland to Denver. But tonight something felt off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. I'd been driving this route for the better part of 15 years, hauling everything from lumber to electronics, and I knew every truck stop, every way station, every patch of road where the asphalt got a little too friendly with the guardrail. The familiarity usually brought comfort, but tonight it felt more like driving through a memory that didn't quite match reality. The exits seemed to come at slightly different intervals. The mile markers appeared just a beat too early or too late, and even the radio stations were playing songs I swore I'd never heard before, though they sounded achingly familiar. Around 2 a.m, just as I was considering pulling off at the next rest area to grab a coffee and shake off this strange feeling, I heard it for the first time. A soft moaning sound, barely audible over the engine noise, seemed to be coming from somewhere behind me in the cab. I glanced in my mirrors, checking the sleeper berth, but everything looked normal. The sound lasted maybe 10 seconds, rising and falling like someone sighing in their sleep. then faded away completely. I turned down the radio and listened more carefully, but heard only the steady thrum of the engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt. Maybe it was just the wind finding a new way through the door seals, or perhaps some piece of cargo had shifted in the trailer, though my load of office furniture had been secured tight enough to survive an earthquake. Still, the sound had been unsettling in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up, though I couldn't say exactly why. 20 miles later, it happened again. This time the moan was longer, more pronounced, and definitely coming from the passenger side of the cab. It sounded almost human, like someone in pain or deep distress, but with a hollow quality that suggested empty spaces and echoing chambers. I pulled over at the next truck stop, a place called Miller's Junction that I'd stopped at hundreds of times before, though tonight it seemed smaller somehow, with fewer lights and empty parking spaces, where I remembered there usually being other rigs. I walked around my truck 3 times, checking every door, every panel, every vent and opening I could think of. The passenger door seemed solid, the seals intact, the hinges properly lubricated and silent when I opened and closed it. I even crawled underneath the cab with my flashlight, looking for loose panels or damaged air lines that might create unusual sounds. But everything appeared normal. The whole inspection took 20 minutes, and when I climbed back into the driver's seat, I was almost convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. But as I pulled back onto the interstate, the moaning returned, and this time it continued for nearly a full minute. The sound seemed to come from within the passenger door itself, as if something was trapped between the inner and outer panels. It rose and fell with an almost musical quality, a wordless song of longing or sorrow that made my chest feel tight and my eyes water for reasons I couldn't explain. The melody, if you could call it that, seemed to follow patterns that were almost familiar, like half-remembered lullabies from childhood, or songs my grandmother used to hum while she worked in her garden. I tried talking to it, feeling foolish but too disturbed to ignore the sound any longer. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the cab. "Is someone there?" The moaning stopped immediately, leaving a silence so complete that even the engine seemed to quiet down, though I knew that was impossible. For the next 50 miles I drove in complete quiet, but I could feel something listening, something waiting just on the other side of that passenger door panel. The next time it started, somewhere around 4 in the morning as I climbed through the mountains of eastern Oregon. The moaning had changed quality. It sounded more urgent now, more desperate, as if whatever was making the sound was running out of time or strength. And beneath the primary tone, I began to hear what sounded like words, though spoken in a language I didn't recognize or in a voice so distorted that meaning slipped away, even as I strained to understand. I found myself leaning toward the passenger side as I drove, pressing my ear as close to the door as I safely could while maintaining control of the truck. The voice, for I was now certain it was a voice, seemed to be telling a story, a long and complex narrative full of emotion and urgency. Sometimes it sounded like pleading, other times like warning, and occasionally it took on the cadence of a prayer or incantation. Dawn was still hours away when I realized I was responding to the voice, nodding along with its inflections, making sympathetic sounds when the tone became particularly sorrowful. I caught myself reaching toward the passenger door handle several times, though I couldn't remember deciding to do so. Each time I jerked my hand back, a wave of disappointment washed over me, though whether it was my disappointment or something else's, I couldn't say. The voice began to teach me words. I don't know how else to describe it. As it spoke, meanings would bloom in my mind like flowers opening to sunlight, words that sounded like wind through. Wheat fields meant longing, phrases that reminded me of rain on window glass meant home and memory and the space between heartbeats. I found myself speaking these words back, my pronunciation improving with each repetition, though I had no idea what language I was learning or why. As the miles rolled by, the voice told me about traveling, about being caught between destinations, about the terrible loneliness of being unable to reach your intended stopping place. It spoke of passengers who had ridden in vehicles for decades, centuries even, always moving but never arriving, always seeking but never finding. The sadness in that voice was so profound that tears began streaming down my face, though I felt more peaceful than I had in years. Somewhere in the pre-dawn darkness, the voice asked me to open the door. Not in words I could translate, but the meaning was unmistakable. It promised me understanding, companionship, and end to the isolation that every long-haul trucker knows intimately. All I had to do was reach over and pull that handle. Just let whatever was speaking to me finally come inside where it could be warm and safe and no longer trapped in the spaces between things. My hand was actually touching the handle when I saw the lights in my side mirror. Another truck was approaching, running hard and fast, and as it pulled alongside me, I could see the driver gesturing frantically. He was pointing at my passenger side, his mouth open in what looked like shouting, though I couldn't hear him over the voice that was now singing directly into my ear, promising me rest and peace and forever friends who would never leave me alone on the dark highways. The other driver stayed beside me for almost 10 miles, matching my speed, continuing to gesture and point. Gradually, his presence seemed to create a buffer against the voice, which grew fainter and more distant, though no less beautiful. When he finally pulled ahead and disappeared into the darkness, the singing had stopped entirely, leaving me feeling hollowed out and bereft, like waking from a wonderful dream into a gray and empty world. I pulled off at the next exit and sat in a 24-hour diner until the sun came up, drinking coffee that tasted like nothing, and staring at truckers who seemed to be moving through thick glass, distant and unreal. When I finally returned to my rig, everything appeared normal. The passenger door opened and closed silently, the panel solid and unremarkable, but sometimes, late at night when the interstate is empty and the radio can't quite find a clear station, I hear that voice again, singing softly from somewhere just out of reach. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch myself slowing down and listening more carefully, my hand drifting toward that passenger door handle, wondering what stories are still waiting to be told, and what kind of passenger might be looking for a ride to wherever it is that voices like that need to go. The load made it to Denver just fine, and I never mentioned the incident in my logbook. But I still drive that route, and I still listen for the singing, because even though it frightened me, it was also the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. And the loneliest part of me hopes that someday I'll be brave enough to find out what it was trying to tell me. The town that remembers. From Marcus Chen, I should have known something was wrong when my GPS lost signal 3 miles outside Echoville. The screen flickered once, twice, then went dark, leaving me with nothing but the steady rumble of my Kenworth's engine and the pale wash of my headlights cutting through the mountain darkness. But I'd been driving these routes for 15 years, hauling everything from electronics to furniture across the Pacific Northwest, and I'd learned to trust my instincts when technology failed me. The highway signs had been clear enough. Echoville, population 847, next exit. I needed fuel, and my logbook demanded a mandatory rest stop. The off-ramp curved down through dense pine forest, the kind of towering evergreens that seemed to lean in over the asphalt like curious giants. My running lights painted their trunks in brief amber flashes as I descended toward the valley floor. The air grew thicker here, heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something metallic and stale, like the smell of old pennies left in a pocket too long. Main Street greeted me with a collection of weathered storefronts and flickering neon signs that seemed to struggle against the encroaching darkness. The Blue Moon Diner sign buzzed intermittently, casting stuttering blue light across wet pavement. A gas station sat at the far end of the street, its overhead canopy illuminated but somehow dim, as if the bulbs were fighting through fog that wasn't there. I eased my rig toward the pumps, air brakes hissing as I came to a stop. That's when I first noticed the echoes. As I climbed down from the cab, my boots hitting the concrete with their usual solid thump, I heard it, the same sound but delayed, as if someone else had stepped down a fraction of a second after me. I paused, listening, but heard only the tick of my cooling engine and the distant hum of electrical transformers. When I walked toward the station office, my footsteps seemed to follow themselves, each step creating a soft, secondary percussion that lagged just behind my own rhythm. The clerk inside was a thin woman with graying hair and eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. She moved with the deliberate slowness of someone walking underwater, her fingers dancing across the register keys with practiced precision. "Passing through?" she asked, her voice carrying a strange quality, as if it were coming from somewhere behind her rather than from her throat. "Just fuel and maybe a coffee," I told her, handing over my credit card. "Quiet town you have here." She smiled then, but it was the kind of smile that never reached the ice. "Oh, Echoville's never quiet. We just listen to different things," as she spoke. I could swear I heard her words repeated somewhere in the store's shadows, a whispered echo that made the hair on my arms stand up. Back outside, I began fueling my truck, the diesel pump's mechanical counting filling the silence. But underneath that familiar sound, I began to pick up other noises, footsteps that matched my own movements exactly, but came from no visible source. When I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, I heard the shuffle of gravel that corresponded perfectly, but seemed to originate from across the street. When I walked around to check my tires, my footsteps were accompanied by their ghostly twins, creating a discordant rhythm that made my skin crawl. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just the acoustics of the valley, maybe some trick of the mountain walls that surrounded the town. But as I completed my walk-around inspection, the echo steps grew more pronounced, more deliberate. They weren't just mimicking my movements, they were anticipating them, arriving a split second before my actual footfalls hit the ground. The realization struck me like cold water. The echoes weren't following my steps. They were leading them. I climbed back into my cab faster than usual, my heart rate picking up as I fired up the engine. The familiar diesel rumble should have been comforting, but even that seemed muffled here, as if the sound were being absorbed by something invisible in the air around me. I decided to push through to the next town rather than take my scheduled rest break. Something about Echoville felt fundamentally wrong, like a photograph that's been slightly overexposed, making everything appear normal until you really looked at it. But as I tried to leave Main Street, I found myself driving in a circle I hadn't intended. The street that should have led back to the highway instead curved around and deposited me right back at the gas station. I tried again, following what I was certain was a different route, only to find myself passing the Blue Moon Diner for the third time. The neon sign seemed brighter now, more insistent, and through the windows I could see figures moving inside, customers who sat perfectly still at their tables, their heads turned toward the street as if they were watching for something. I pulled over and consulted my physical map, the old-fashioned kind that had saved me more times than I could count when GPS failed. According to the map, there should have been a clear route back to the highway, a simple left turn at the end of Main Street. But when I followed those directions precisely, I found myself driving through residential neighborhoods that seemed to stretch on forever, lined with houses that all looked identical in the darkness. Porch lights glowed in perfect unison, and I began to notice that curtains moved in windows as I passed, as if invisible occupants were tracking my progress. The most disturbing part was the sound my truck made on these residential streets. The engine's rumble seemed to bounce off the houses in impossible ways, creating harmonics and resonances that formed an almost musical pattern. It was as if the entire town were designed as some kind of acoustic instrument, and my presence was striking notes in a composition I couldn't understand. When I finally stopped to collect my thoughts, parking under a streetlight that cast everything in sickly yellow tones, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My truck's engine was idling with its usual rhythm, but I could hear other engines idling too, the exact same make and model, the exact same RPM, creating a chorus of invisible trucks that surrounded me in the darkness. I revved my engine experimentally, and the ghostly fleet revved in perfect synchronization, their collective rumble filling the night air with mechanical harmony. I grabbed my CB radio and called out on Channel 19, hoping to reach another driver, anyone who might be able to give me directions out of this maze. Breaker 19, this is Nighthawk looking for a copy. Anyone familiar with Echoville? Static answered me at first, then slowly. My own voice began to filter back through the speaker, not the normal radio echo from atmospheric bounce, but my exact words repeated with subtle variations, as if multiple versions of myself were responding from different locations throughout the town. This is Nighthawk. My own voice crackled through the radio, but the tone was slightly different, more urgent. Don't trust the streets. They remember everyone who's been here. Nighthawk to Nighthawk, came another transmission in my voice, this one carrying notes of desperation I didn't remember putting there. The town collects us. Our sounds, our movements, our presence. It's building something. I switched off the radio with trembling hands, but the transmissions continued, growing stronger and more numerous. Dozens of versions of my own voice filled the airwaves, all carrying fragments of conversations I'd never had, reporting locations I'd never visited, describing loads I'd never hauled. It was as if Echoville had been recording every trucker who'd ever passed through, and was now playing back their experiences simultaneously. That's when I understood what the town clerk had meant. Echoville didn't just echo sounds, it collected them, stored them, and eventually began to replay them. Every footstep, every engine rumble, every word spoken within its boundaries became part of an ever-growing symphony of captured life. The town wasn't just remembering these sounds. It was using them to create something new, something that needed the patterns and rhythms of human activity to function. I floored the accelerator, no longer caring about following streets or obeying traffic signs. My truck roared through the residential maze with desperate power, and behind me I could hear the sound of dozens of invisible trucks doing the same thing, their engines screaming in harmony as they followed routes I couldn't see. The cacophony was overwhelming. Every truck that had ever tried to escape Echoville was now running the same desperate race, their sounds layered on top of each other in an automotive symphony of panic. The breakthrough came suddenly, like emerging from underwater. One moment I was surrounded by the oppressive acoustic maze of the town, and the next I was climbing back up the mountain road, my headlights cutting through clean forest air that no longer tasted of metal and stagnation. In my mirrors, Echoville's lights faded quickly, swallowed by the darkness between the trees.